Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Eric Cartman is one of the most psychologically complex characters in animated television. And while we cannot diagnose a cartoon character clinically, examining his behavior through a psychological lens reveals consistent patterns of manipulation, emotional dysregulation, and defensive self-perception that trained psychologists would immediately recognize. By exploring how Cartman interacts with his family, manipulates his peers, pursues goals with obsessive intensity, and justifies harmful actions through self-serving logic, we can understand what makes him such a fascinating study in personality, patterns, and behavioral psychology. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Cartman's early personality and family context. Understanding Eric Cartman requires starting at the beginning, looking at how he was introduced in the very first episodes of South Park, and examining the family environment that shaped his early development. From the moment Cartman appeared on screen in the pilot episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, in August 1997, he was different from the other kids in fundamental ways. He was louder, more aggressive, more selfish, and more willing to say terrible things without any apparent guilt or shame. These early episodes established patterns of behavior that would define Cartman's character for the next 25 years, and counting. Cartman lived alone with his mother Leanne in a house that seemed comfortable and well-maintained compared to Kenny's obvious poverty, or even the modest middle-class homes of Stan and Kyle. The Cartman house had nice furniture, a television, toys, and all the material comforts a child could want. Leanne Cartman was introduced as a single mother who worked multiple jobs to support her son, though the show would later reveal these jobs were often in the sex industry. What became immediately clear in early episodes was that Leanne had an unusual parenting style that differed dramatically from how other parents in South Park raised their children. The most obvious characteristic of Leanne's parenting was complete permissiveness. She said yes to virtually everything Cartman wanted. When Cartman demanded something, Leanne would give it to him without question or hesitation. When Cartman misbehaved, Leanne rarely imposed consequences or discipline. She seemed unable or unwilling to set boundaries for her son's behavior. This permissive approach appeared in episode after episode throughout the early seasons, and continued as a consistent pattern throughout the entire series run. In Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut from season 1, the show explored more of Cartman's home life and his relationship with his mother. The episode dealt with Cartman trying to figure out who his father was, which required understanding his mother's complicated past. What became clear was that Leanne had a very active personal life that Cartman was somewhat aware of even as a young child. The episode showed Leanne as someone who struggled to maintain authority in her own home, and who consistently gave in to Cartman's demands, even when doing so was clearly bad for him. A psychologist observing Cartman's early family environment would immediately note several factors that research suggests can significantly influence child development. The absence of a father figure meant Cartman lacked a male role model in his daily life, and had no consistent male authority figure to set limits on his behavior. The permissive parenting style meant Cartman rarely experienced consequences for negative behaviors, which can seriously interfere with learning impulse control and understanding social boundaries. The inconsistent discipline meant Cartman could not predict what would happen when he misbehaved, which can contribute to both anxiety and increased acting out behaviors. The early episodes also showed Cartman exhibiting behaviors that would concern any psychologist observing a real child. He showed consistent aggression toward his peers, often hitting, kicking, or verbally attacking other children when he became angry or frustrated. In Weight Gain 4000 from season 1, Cartman became obsessed with winning an essay contest and being on television with Kathy Lee Gifford. When things did not go according to his plan, he reacted with extreme anger and aggressive behavior. His emotional responses were disproportionate to the situations triggering them, showing poor emotional regulation even for a young child. Cartman also demonstrated early signs of what psychologists call theory of mind deficits. Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, feelings, and perspectives that differ from your own. This is a crucial developmental milestone that typically emerges in early childhood. Cartman consistently struggled with this concept throughout early episodes. He assumed everyone thought the way he did and wanted what he wanted. When other children disagreed with him or had different preferences, Cartman seemed genuinely confused and often became angry, as if their different perspective was a personal attack against him rather than simply a different viewpoint. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig from Season 1 showed Cartman trying to breed an elephant with a pig to create a pot-bellied elephant he could enter in a science fair. The episode demonstrated Cartman's ability to focus intensely on goals he cared about while completely disregarding how his actions affected others around him. He manipulated his friends into helping him with his scheme. He lied about his intentions and his methods. He showed no concern for the welfare of the animals involved in his experiment. A psychologist would note this pattern of using others as tools to achieve personal goals, without any consideration of their well-being or autonomy. The early seasons established that Cartman had significant intelligence and capability when he chose to apply himself to something he cared about. He could plan complex schemes that required multiple steps. He could manipulate social situations to his advantage. He could figure out how to get what he wanted through strategic thinking rather than just through tantrums or violence. This intelligence made his behavioral problems more concerning rather than less, because it showed his actions were often deliberate choices rather than impulsive mistakes he could not control or understand. A psychologist would distinguish between a child who lacks the cognitive ability to understand consequences versus a child who understands consequences perfectly well, but chooses harmful actions anyway because the consequences do not matter to them. Cartman clearly fell into the second category. He understood that his actions hurt people. He understood that there might be consequences. He simply did not care enough about either of these things to change his behavior. Damien, from Season 1, showed Cartman throwing a birthday party and becoming absolutely furious when he did not receive the presents he wanted from his guests. His reaction went far beyond normal childhood disappointment about gifts. He screamed at his guests in rage. He called them terrible names. He physically attacked them for bringing gifts he considered inadequate or insulting. The episode showed Cartman's profound sense of entitlement, his belief that others owed him specific things, and his complete inability to modulate his emotional response, even in social situations where such outbursts would obviously damage his relationships with peers. Cartman's relationship with his peers in early episodes was characterized by a pattern psychologists call instrumental aggression. This means aggression that is used as a tool to achieve goals rather than aggressive outbursts triggered primarily by anger or emotional arousal. Cartman would hurt or threaten other children deliberately and calculatedly to make them comply with his wishes. He would insult them strategically to establish dominance in the social hierarchy. He would manipulate their emotions intentionally to control their behavior. This instrumental use of aggression suggested a level of calculation and planning that went beyond typical childhood conflicts over toys or playground disputes. The early episodes also showed Cartman exhibiting what psychologists call externalizing behaviors. These are behaviors that direct psychological distress outward toward the environment and other people, rather than inward toward the self. Instead of feeling sad or anxious when things went wrong, Cartman became angry and aggressive toward others. Instead of internalizing failure as a reflection on his own limitations, he blamed external factors and other people for his problems. This externalizing pattern appeared consistently across many different situations and contexts. Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh from Season 1 had a subplot about Cartman trying to participate in the school Christmas play, despite being overweight and lacking obvious talent for singing or performing. When the teacher gave the lead role to another student who was more suited for it, Cartman did not respond with sadness, disappointment, or self-reflection about how he might improve his skills. Instead, he responded with rage and accusations that the decision was unfair and discriminatory. He could not accept that another child might be legitimately better suited for the role. This inability to accept outcomes he disliked without becoming aggressive and accusatory appeared repeatedly in early episodes. Cartman's early behavior also showed signs of what psychologists call hostile attribution bias. This is the tendency to interpret ambiguous social situations as threatening or hostile, even when they are actually neutral or even friendly. Cartman consistently assumed other people were trying to hurt him, exclude him, or treat him unfairly, when their actual intentions were often neutral or even positive. This bias made him respond with aggression to situations that did not warrant aggressive responses, creating conflicts where none actually needed to exist. The permissive parenting style Leanne employed contributed to Cartman's behavioral patterns in ways that any psychologist would immediately recognize. Children need boundaries and consistent consequences to learn self-regulation and social skills. These are not optional elements of development. When Leanne failed to set limits on Cartman's behavior, He never developed internal mechanisms for controlling his impulses or moderating his emotional reactions. When she gave him whatever he wanted, without requiring him to work for things or wait for them, he never learned to tolerate frustration or delay gratification. When she did not enforce rules consistently, he learned that persistence and escalation would eventually get him what he wanted, regardless of how he behaved. Chicken Lover, from Season 2, showed Cartman being given temporary police authority as part of a storyline about Officer Barbrady learning to read. The episode revealed how Cartman responded to having power and authority over other people. He did not use his temporary authority to help or protect others. He did not try to solve crimes or keep people safe. Instead, he used his power to dominate and punish people who annoyed him. He beat people with his nightstick for minor infractions. He enjoyed making others fear him. A psychologist would note this as important evidence of what fundamentally motivates Cartman's behavior. He did not seek power to accomplish positive goals or to help others. He sought power as an end in itself, enjoying the feeling of control over other people. Early episodes established that Cartman had extremely limited capacity for genuine friendship or emotional intimacy with others. His relationships with Stan, Kyle, and Kenny were transactional rather than emotionally connected. He spent time with them because they were available playmates in a small town with limited options, and because he could sometimes manipulate them into helping him achieve his goals. When these boys stood up to him or refused his demands, Cartman had no loyalty to them whatsoever. He would turn on them instantly without hesitation, showing that his attachment to them was shallow and entirely self-serving. The early family context also revealed that Cartman experienced some degree of emotional neglect, despite living in material comfort. Leanne worked long hours at multiple jobs and was often absent from the home during Cartman's waking hours. When she was present, she interacted with Cartman primarily by giving him things and saying yes to his demands, rather than providing emotional connection, guidance, or active parenting. A psychologist would note that children need more than just material provision. They need emotional attunement, consistent presence, and active, engaged parenting. Cartman received gifts and permissiveness instead of the emotional scaffolding that helps children develop healthy personality patterns and social skills. Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000, from Season 4, showed Cartman being sent to juvenile detention for throwing a rock at Token and giving him a black eye. The episode revealed how Cartman responded to institutional consequences when his mother's permissiveness was removed and he faced actual punishment. He did not become more compliant or reflective about his behavior. He did not express remorse or attempt to make amends. Instead, he became more manipulative and began planning an elaborate escape. He could not accept that he had done something wrong that deserved punishment. He could only think about how to avoid the consequences and get back to his preferred state of doing whatever he wanted without restriction. These early patterns established in Seasons 1 through 4 created the foundation for understanding Cartman's psychology throughout the entire series' run. A psychologist observing these early episodes would see a child with significant behavioral and emotional problems, stemming from a combination of temperamental factors and environmental influences. The permissive parenting, the absent father, the material indulgence without emotional connection, and Cartman's own apparent temperamental difficulties with empathy and impulse control all contributed to creating the complex behavioral patterns that would define his character across hundreds of episodes. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The early episodes establish Cartman's family context and basic personality, revealing how one particular trait would come to define nearly everything he did. Section 2. Lack of empathy and social manipulation. One of the most striking aspects of Eric Cartman's personality is his apparent inability or unwillingness to experience empathy for other people. Empathy is the capacity to understand and share the feelings of others, to imagine what someone else is experiencing emotionally, and to care about their well-being. A psychologist observing Cartman's behavior across hundreds of episodes would note a consistent and pervasive pattern of empathy deficits that manifest in virtually every social interaction he has. Empathy has two components that psychologists study separately. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand intellectually what someone else is feeling and thinking. Affective empathy is the emotional response of actually feeling concern or distress when you recognize someone else is suffering. Cartman demonstrates that he possesses cognitive empathy. He understands perfectly well what other people are feeling and what they want. His problem is with affective empathy. He understands others' emotions but does not care about them except as information he can use to manipulate situations to his advantage. Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5 is perhaps the clearest demonstration of Cartman's empathy deficits and his capacity for calculated cruelty. The episode begins with an older boy named Scott Tenorman selling his pubic hair to Cartman for $10 as a prank. Cartman realizes he has been tricked and becomes obsessed with getting revenge. Throughout the episode, Cartman tries various schemes to get back at Scott, all of which fail because Scott is smarter and keeps outsmarting him. The reveal at the end of the episode showed the depths of Cartman's lack of empathy in ways that shocked even longtime South Park viewers. Cartman had orchestrated an elaborate plan where Scott's parents were killed, their bodies were ground into meat, that meat was made into chili, and Scott was tricked into eating that chili at a chili cook-off, while Cartman watched and smiled. When Scott realized what he had eaten and broke down crying in horror and grief, Cartman's reaction was not remorse or discomfort. He smiled wider and licked Scott's tears, savoring his enemy's suffering as the ultimate victory. A psychologist analyzing this episode would note several significant things about how Cartman approached this situation. First, the revenge was disproportionate to the offense. Being tricked out of $10 did not justify murdering two people. Second, the revenge targeted not just Scott, but innocent people who had nothing to do with the original offense. Third, Cartman planned the revenge in detail over an extended period, showing this was not an impulsive act, but a deliberate choice. Fourth, Cartman felt no remorse whatsoever, and instead felt joy and satisfaction when confronting Scott's suffering. The episode also showed Cartman's cognitive empathy at work. He understood perfectly what Scott was feeling when he realized what he had eaten. That understanding was necessary for Cartman to achieve his goal of making Scott suffer maximally. Cartman used his understanding of how Scott's mind worked to engineer the exact situation that would cause the most psychological damage. This demonstrates that Cartman's problem is not that he cannot understand emotions. His problem is that he experiences no emotional response that would make him care about the pain he causes. Casa Bonita from Season 7 showed Cartman's manipulative abilities in a different context. Kyle was having a birthday party at Casa Bonita, a Mexican restaurant that Cartman loved, but Kyle did not want to invite Cartman to the party. Cartman became obsessed with getting invited and constructed an elaborate scheme where he convinced Butters that the apocalypse was happening and locked Butters in a bomb shelter so that Kyle would need to invite Cartman as a replacement guest since. Butters could not attend. The episode showed Cartman's willingness to psychologically torture an innocent person for weeks to achieve a trivial goal of attending a birthday party. Butters suffered genuine fear and distress, thinking the world had ended and his family was dead. Cartman maintained this deception without any apparent guilt or concern for Butters' emotional state. When the scheme was finally revealed, Cartman showed no remorse for what he had done to Butters. He only cared that he had gotten what he wanted, which was access to Casa Bonita. A psychologist would note that Cartman's manipulation of Butters demonstrated several important patterns. He selected a victim who was particularly vulnerable and trusting. He exploited that vulnerability deliberately and systematically. He sustained the manipulation over an extended period without his resolve weakening. He showed no emotional distress while causing another person significant psychological harm. He expressed no guilt or remorse when caught. These patterns suggest someone who views other people as objects to be used, rather than as individuals with feelings that matter. Christian Rock Hard from Season 7 had Cartman forming a Christian rock band to win a bet with Kyle about who could get a platinum record first. Cartman knew nothing about Christianity and cared nothing about Christian values. He simply identified Christian rock as an underserved market he could exploit. Throughout the episode, Cartman used religious language and imagery purely instrumentally, with no genuine belief or respect for what these symbols meant to actual believers. The episode showed Cartman recruiting Token and Butters for his band and manipulating them into going along with his scheme. When Token questioned Cartman's sincerity about Christianity, Cartman had no hesitation about lying directly about his faith. When the band members wanted to quit, Cartman manipulated their emotions to keep them involved. A psychologist would observe that Cartman had no internal conflict about using religion dishonestly or about manipulating his bandmates. His goal was winning the bet with Kyle, and any method of achieving that goal was acceptable to him. Cartman's interactions with his mother Leanne throughout the series demonstrated another aspect of his empathy deficits. Leanne loved Cartman and tried to make him happy despite his terrible behavior toward her. Cartman routinely insulted his mother, called her degrading names, made fun of her sexual history, and treated her with contempt. A psychologist would note that most children, even children with behavioral problems, show some positive attachment to caregivers who provide for them. Cartman showed no gratitude, no affection, and no concern for his mother's feelings. From Season 10 showed Leanne finally attempting to get help with Cartman's behavior by hiring various experts to train her in discipline techniques. The episode brought in a dog training specialist named Cesar Milan, who successfully used behavior modification techniques to control Cartman's worst behaviors. However, the episode revealed that Cartman could manipulate even highly trained professionals. When Leanne began developing romantic feelings for Cesar, Cartman deliberately sabotaged the relationship because he preferred his mother remain single and focused entirely on him. The episode demonstrated that Cartman understood how relationships worked and how emotions developed between people. He recognized that his mother was becoming attached to Cesar, and that this attachment threatened Cartman's position as the center of her attention. He strategically destroyed the relationship by making Cesar believe Leanne was emotionally unstable. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed sophisticated social intelligence in engineering this outcome, while simultaneously showing complete absence of concern for his mother's happiness or well-being. Cartman's treatment of Kyle throughout the series showed a particular kind of obsessive focus that combined with his empathy deficits in disturbing ways. Cartman seemed to hate Kyle more than anyone else and devoted enormous time and energy to making Kyle suffer. The Passion of the Jew from Season 8 had Cartman dressing as Hitler and organizing a rally to exterminate Jews, which he filmed and showed to Kyle specifically to cause him distress. The episode showed Cartman using Kyle's ethnic identity as a weapon to attack him psychologically. A psychologist analyzing Cartman's obsession with Kyle would note several patterns. Cartman's hatred seemed disproportionate to anything Kyle actually did to him. Kyle generally tried to be moral and fair, which made him frequently oppose Cartman's schemes. Yet this did not justify the intensity of Cartman's animosity. Cartman's anti-Semitism appeared to be at least partly instrumental, used because he knew it would hurt Kyle, rather than stemming from genuine ideological conviction. Cartman's willingness to invoke Holocaust imagery and Nazi symbolism to torment one specific Jewish child showed both his lack of empathy and his lack of moral boundaries. Ginger Kids from Season 9 showed Cartman starting a hate movement against red-haired children and then switching sides when he thought he was a redhead himself. The episode demonstrated that Cartman's prejudices were not deeply held beliefs, but rather tools he used to organize social hierarchies with himself at the top. When he thought he was part of the despised group, he immediately reversed his position and began advocating for supremacy of that same group. A psychologist would note, this flexibility suggests his hateful rhetoric serves social and emotional functions, rather than reflecting actual convictions. Cartman's empathy deficits extended to his treatment of animals as well as people. In multiple episodes, Cartman showed no concern for animal welfare and would hurt animals without hesitation if it served his purposes. Yikes from Season 11 had Cartman unconcerned about a cat dying. Major Boobage from Season 12 showed Cartman willing to suffocate Kenny's cat to prevent Kenny from getting high off cat urine. A psychologist would note that cruelty to animals in childhood is considered a significant warning sign for potential development of more serious antisocial behaviors. The consistency of Cartman's empathy deficits across hundreds of episodes and thousands of interactions is what makes this pattern so psychologically significant. This is not occasional meanness or periodic selfishness. This is a pervasive inability or unwillingness to care about other people's suffering that appears in virtually every social situation Cartman encounters. Whether dealing with friends, family, strangers, or enemies, Cartman's response is the same. He understands what they feel, but does not care, except when he can use that information to manipulate them. A psychologist would distinguish between someone who lacks empathy due to cognitive limitations versus someone who lacks empathy despite having the cognitive capacity for it. Cartman clearly has the intellectual ability to understand others' perspectives and emotions. His problem is not stupidity or inability to read social cues. His problem is that recognizing someone else's pain does not create any emotional response in him that would inhibit him from causing more pain. This pattern has a name in psychological literature, though diagnosing cartoon characters is neither possible nor appropriate. What makes Cartman's empathy deficits particularly concerning from a psychological perspective is how early they appeared and how stable they remained over time. The patterns visible in Season 1 persisted essentially unchanged through Season 25. Most children with behavioral problems show some improvement as they mature and develop better self-regulation skills. Cartman showed no improvement. If anything, he became more sophisticated in his manipulations while maintaining the same fundamental inability to care about others. The combination of high intelligence with low empathy is what makes Cartman such an effective manipulator. He can analyze social situations and understand what people want and fear. He can construct elaborate plans that exploit others' weaknesses. He can lie convincingly because he feels no guilt about lying. He can sustain long-term schemes because he experiences no emotional distress while hurting others. These capabilities make him dangerous to everyone around him in ways that would deeply concern any psychologist observing his behavior. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's lack of empathy made his manipulations possible, and these manipulations were enabled by his considerable intelligence and strategic thinking abilities. Section 3. Intelligence and Strategic Behavior. One of the most psychologically interesting aspects of Eric Cartman is the combination of his significant intelligence with his complete lack of moral constraints. A psychologist observing Cartman would note that he possesses considerable cognitive abilities, including strategic planning, social manipulation, creative problem solving, and the ability to execute complex, multi-step schemes. What makes this intelligence psychologically significant is how Cartman uses these abilities exclusively to pursue selfish goals, without any apparent concern for ethics, morality, or the well-being of others. Cartman's intelligence manifests most clearly in his capacity for long-term planning and strategic thinking. He can envision a desired outcome, identify obstacles preventing that outcome, devise creative solutions to overcome those obstacles, and execute plans that require coordinating multiple elements over extended periods. These are sophisticated cognitive abilities that require abstract thinking, mental flexibility, and the capacity to hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously while working toward a goal. Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5 remains the clearest demonstration of Cartman's strategic intelligence in the entire series. After being humiliated repeatedly by an older boy who kept outsmarting his revenge attempts, Cartman constructed a plan of extraordinary complexity. He researched Scott's family situation and discovered that Scott's parents owned a pony farm. He then engineered a situation where a farmer named Denkins would want to kill Scott's parents because Cartman had trained their pony to bite off Denkins' wife's artificial limb. The plan required Cartman to understand multiple people's motivations and predict how they would behave. He had to know that Denkins would seek revenge for the pony attack. He had to arrange for Scott's parents to be in a specific location at a specific time. He had to coordinate with a local chili cook-off to ensure Scott would be present at the right moment. He had to involve Radiohead, Scott's favorite band, to make sure Scott would attend the event and to have witnesses to Scott's breakdown. A psychologist analyzing this episode would note several things about Cartman's cognitive abilities. First, the plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cause and effect across multiple steps. Second, it showed Cartman could delay gratification, working toward a goal over time rather than seeking immediate satisfaction. Third, it revealed his ability to manipulate multiple social situations simultaneously. Fourth, it showed he could predict how different people would respond to various situations and engineer those responses. The episode also demonstrated that Cartman's intelligence was not impaired by his lack of empathy. Sometimes people assume that individuals who lack empathy must also lack other cognitive abilities, but Cartman proved this assumption wrong. His empathy deficits did not prevent him from understanding how people think and feel. They simply meant he felt no emotional discomfort while using that understanding to cause suffering. Casa Bonita from Season 7 showed Cartman's strategic abilities in a different context. When Kyle refused to invite Cartman to his birthday party at Casa Bonita, Cartman became obsessed with getting invited. He identified that Kyle needed a specific number of guests and that Butters was one of those guests. Cartman then constructed an elaborate deception where he convinced Butters that a meteor had struck the Earth and that everyone except Butters had died. The plan required Cartman to create a convincing post-apocalyptic environment in his basement. He had to obtain news footage and edit it to support his story about the meteor strike. He had to keep Butters isolated and convinced for an extended period. He had to ensure that Kyle would discover Butters was missing at exactly the right time, so that Cartman would be the obvious replacement guest. The coordination and planning required for this scheme demonstrated high-level executive functioning and organizational skills. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed no difficulty with the cognitive demands of maintaining a complex deception over time. He remembered all the details of his story. He anticipated Butters' questions and prepared answers. He adapted his approach when unexpected complications arose. These abilities showed that Cartman's problems were not cognitive deficits. He could think, plan, and execute complex tasks. His problems were with motivation, values, and his complete disregard for the harm his actions caused to others. Christian Rock Hard from Season 7 demonstrated another aspect of Cartman's intelligence: his ability to analyze systems and identify opportunities for exploitation. When Kyle bet Cartman that Cartman's band could not get a platinum record before Kyle's band did, Cartman analyzed the music industry and identified Christian rock as an underserved market with low competition. This required market analysis, understanding of supply and demand, and strategic thinking about competitive advantage. Cartman then systematically converted popular love songs into Christian rock songs by replacing romantic references with religious references. He understood that the emotional structure of love songs and worship songs was essentially identical, and that he could exploit this similarity. He recruited Token and Butters for his band by identifying their specific vulnerabilities and using those to manipulate them into joining. Token was told the band would be musically sophisticated. Butters was simply told what to do and complied because that was his nature. The episode showed Cartman's ability to work backward from a goal to identify necessary steps. He wanted a platinum record. He identified that Christian rock had lower sales requirements for platinum status. He created Christian rock music through systematic conversion of existing songs. He marketed to the Christian music audience. Each step logically followed from the previous step, showing clear means-ends reasoning. A psychologist observing Cartman's behavior in this episode would note his capacity for instrumental reasoning. This means using tools and methods as means to achieve desired ends. Cartman understood that the band was a tool, that Christian rock was a tool, that Token's musical ability was a tool, and that religious imagery was a tool. He assembled these tools strategically to achieve his goal of winning the bet with Kyle. His complete lack of genuine religious belief did not impair his ability to use religion instrumentally. The death of Eric Cartman from Season 9 showed Cartman's ability to adapt his strategies when circumstances changed unexpectedly. When the other children decided to ignore Cartman completely and act as if he did not exist, Cartman eventually concluded he must be dead, and therefore must be a ghost. Once he adopted this belief, he began trying to resolve his unfinished business so his spirit could move on to the afterlife. The episode demonstrated Cartman's capacity to construct elaborate explanatory frameworks to make sense of confusing situations. He gathered evidence that seemed to support his ghost theory. He interpreted events through this framework. He developed specific beliefs about what he needed to do as a ghost. While his conclusions were obviously wrong, the cognitive processes he used were sophisticated. He observed patterns, formed hypotheses, tested those hypotheses against new evidence, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. A psychologist would note that Cartman's intelligence did not prevent him from reaching false conclusions when his starting assumptions were wrong. Intelligence and rationality are not the same thing. Cartman could think logically within a framework, but he was not good at questioning whether the framework itself made sense. This is actually a common pattern in human cognition. Smart people can be just as susceptible to false beliefs as anyone else if they do not critically examine their basic assumptions. Fatbeard, from Season 13, showed Cartman's ability to research complex topics and synthesize information into actionable plans. When Cartman decided to become a Somali pirate, he did research about piracy, learned about the political situation in Somalia, studied the tactics pirates used, and recruited other children to join his pirate crew. The plan was completely impractical and based on romanticized ideas about piracy, but the research and planning process itself demonstrated cognitive abilities. Cartman created an organizational structure for his pirate crew with specific roles and responsibilities. He developed rules and procedures. He obtained equipment and supplies. He arranged transportation to Somalia. Each of these tasks required planning, coordination, and problem solving. A psychologist would observe that Cartman could handle complex organizational tasks when he was motivated by a goal he cared about, even when that goal was completely unrealistic. 1% from Season 15 demonstrated Cartman's ability to construct elaborate conspiracy theories and investigative processes. When Cartman was identified as the student who scored lowest on a physical fitness test and caused the entire school to be punished, he became convinced that someone had framed him. He set up a murder investigation board with photographs, string connecting different pieces of evidence, and elaborate theories about who was responsible. The episode showed Cartman's pattern-seeking behavior and his tendency to see connections between unrelated events. He gathered evidence, interviewed suspects, and developed increasingly complex theories about the conspiracy against him. While his conclusions were paranoid and false, the investigative process itself showed systematic thinking and organized information gathering. A psychologist might note that Cartman's intelligence sometimes worked against him by allowing him to construct convincing explanations for things that were not actually true. Cartman's intelligence also manifested in his verbal abilities and his capacity to construct persuasive arguments when he wanted something. The Passion of the Jew from Season 8 showed Cartman organizing a political movement using sophisticated rhetorical techniques. He held rallies with prepared speeches. He used imagery and symbols strategically to evoke specific emotional responses. He built coalitions with other groups who shared some of his goals, even though their ultimate aims differed. A psychologist analyzing Cartman's verbal intelligence would note his sophisticated vocabulary when he chose to use it, his ability to adapt his communication style to different audiences, and his skill at identifying what arguments would be most persuasive to specific people. Cartman understood that different people respond to different types of appeals. He would use emotional appeals with some people, logical arguments with others, and threats or bribes with still others, depending on what he thought would be most effective. The Coon trilogy across seasons 13 and 14 showed Cartman's ability to create elaborate personas and maintain them consistently over extended periods. When Cartman decided to become a superhero called the Coon, he created a detailed backstory, a costume, specific abilities and weapons, and a consistent way of speaking and acting while in character. Maintaining this persona required remembering the details he had established and behaving consistently with the character he had created. The trilogy also showed Cartman's strategic thinking about public relations and media manipulation. He understood that being a successful superhero required not just fighting crime, but also managing how the public perceived him. He tried to control media narratives about his activities. He competed with other children's superhero personas for public attention and recognition. These activities showed understanding of how reputation and public image work in society. A psychologist would note that Cartman's ability to create and maintain elaborate personas suggested he had strong self-monitoring abilities. He could observe his own behavior and adjust it to match the image he wanted to project. This requires metacognition, which means thinking about your own thinking. Cartman could step back mentally and evaluate whether his actions were achieving his goals, then modify his approach if they were not. Chupacabra from Season 16 showed Cartman's ability to synthesize information from multiple sources into a coherent narrative framework. He researched Jewish traditions surrounding Passover, combined this with information about the Chupacabra legend, and created an entirely new mythological creature called the Chupacabra. While the result was absurd, the process of combining different cultural elements into a new synthesis showed creative thinking and cultural awareness. The episode also demonstrated Cartman's understanding of how fear operates in communities and how rumors spread. He deliberately spread stories about the Chupacabra to create panic and achieve his goal of ruining the town's Easter egg hunt. He understood that people are more likely to believe frightening stories when they come from multiple sources, so he coordinated with others to spread the same story simultaneously. This showed sophisticated understanding of social psychology and group behavior. A psychologist observing Cartman's intelligence across all these episodes would conclude that he possessed high cognitive abilities in multiple domains. He could plan strategically, think abstractly, solve complex problems, understand social systems, use language effectively, and adapt his behavior to achieve goals. His intelligence was not limited to a single area, but appeared across different types of tasks and situations. What made Cartman's intelligence psychologically concerning was how he used these abilities. Intelligence can be used to help others, to create things of value, to solve problems that benefit communities, or to understand the world more deeply. Cartman used his intelligence almost exclusively to manipulate others, to achieve selfish goals, to avoid consequences for bad behavior, and to hurt people who opposed him. A psychologist would note that intelligence without moral constraints or empathy can make someone more dangerous rather than less dangerous. The combination of high intelligence with the empathy deficits and behavioral patterns discussed in previous sections created a specific psychological profile. Cartman was not simply acting on impulse or failing to think about consequences. He thought carefully about consequences and planned his actions deliberately to achieve specific outcomes. He just did not care that those outcomes involved hurting others. His intelligence made his manipulations more effective and his schemes more elaborate, but it did not make him more moral or more capable of caring about other people. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's strategic intelligence allowed him to plan elaborate schemes, yet these same cognitive abilities seemed completely unable to help him control his emotional reactions when things did not go his way. Section 4. Emotional reactivity and impulse control. While Cartman demonstrated considerable intelligence and planning ability when pursuing his goals, a psychologist would also observe a striking pattern of emotional dysregulation and poor impulse control that appeared throughout the series. Emotional dysregulation means difficulty managing emotional responses in ways that are appropriate to situations. Cartman showed consistent patterns of explosive reactions, disproportionate anger, and inability to modulate his emotional responses, even when his outbursts worked against his own interests. A psychologist observing Cartman would note the contrast between his capacity for long-term planning in some contexts and his complete inability to control emotional impulses in other contexts. This suggests that Cartman's problems were not simply about lacking control in general. Instead, he seemed to have very selective control. When working towards something he wanted, he could plan patiently and delay gratification. When encountering obstacles or frustrations, he would explode emotionally without considering consequences. The 1% from Season 15 provided one of the clearest examples of Cartman's emotional dysregulation in response to perceived threats. The episode began with Cartman being identified as the student who scored lowest on a physical fitness test, which resulted in the entire school being punished with mandatory fitness activities. When the other students discovered that Cartman was responsible for their punishment, they turned against him and started treating him with hostility and contempt. Cartman's reaction to this social rejection went far beyond normal upset feelings about being disliked. He became completely consumed by paranoia and defensiveness. He could not accept that his poor fitness was the actual reason for the situation. Instead, he constructed elaborate conspiracy theories about being framed. He spent days investigating who he thought was responsible. He created detailed charts with photographs and string connecting different pieces of supposed evidence. His emotional response completely overtook his daily life and functioning. The episode showed Cartman lying in bed, unable to sleep because he was so preoccupied with his feelings of persecution. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's emotional reaction had become so intense that it interfered with basic self-care and normal functioning. He stopped eating normally. He stopped engaging in his usual activities. He became completely fixated on his emotional distress. This pattern of emotional responses becoming so overwhelming that they disrupt normal functioning is a significant psychological concern. What made Cartman's reaction particularly striking was that the situation was genuinely his fault. He actually was the least fit student. The school's response was directly caused by his poor performance. A person with good emotional regulation might feel embarrassed or motivated to improve, but they would recognize the cause and effect relationship. Cartman could not tolerate the emotional discomfort of acknowledging his responsibility, so his mind created an alternative explanation that protected his ego while generating intense paranoia and distress. Breast Cancer Show Ever from Season 12 demonstrated another pattern in Cartman's emotional dysregulation: his inability to control aggressive impulses even when facing certain negative consequences. In this episode, Cartman made fun of breast cancer during a school assembly. When a girl named Wendy called him out for being insensitive and challenged him to a fight after school, Cartman initially acted tough and accepted the challenge. As the day progressed and the fight approached, Cartman became increasingly anxious about facing consequences for his behavior. He tried to get authority figures to prevent the fight. He attempted to manipulate the situation to avoid fighting. He even tried to get the fight postponed. A psychologist would note that Cartman could clearly anticipate negative consequences and feel anxiety about them. Yet this anticipation did not prevent him from engaging in the provocative behavior that created the situation in the first place. The episode revealed an important pattern in Cartman's emotional and behavioral control. He could not control the impulse to say cruel things and make fun of serious topics, even though he knew this behavior would create problems for him later. Once he had created a problem through his impulsive cruelty, he would then use all his intelligence and manipulative abilities to try to escape consequences. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the series. Le Petit Tourette from season 11 showed Cartman's lack of impulse control in a different context. When Cartman learned about Tourette syndrome and discovered that people with Tourette's sometimes have involuntary outbursts where they say inappropriate things, he immediately began faking the condition so he could say whatever offensive things he wanted without consequences. A psychologist would note that Cartman's first response to learning about this condition was not sympathy for people who suffer from it, but rather recognition that he could exploit it. The episode showed Cartman unable to resist saying increasingly offensive things, even though doing so put his deception at risk. He started saying horrible things on national television during an interview about Tourette's. He could not control his impulse to say the most shocking things he could think of, even when maintaining a more moderate deception would have served his interests better. His need for immediate gratification from saying outrageous things overrode his strategic interest in maintaining a convincing fake diagnosis. A psychologist analyzing this episode would observe that Cartman's impulsivity was specifically tied to opportunities for aggression, dominance, and saying cruel things. He did not show the same impulsivity with other types of behaviors. He could be patient and controlled when planning schemes. His impulsivity appeared specifically in contexts where he could hurt others, assert dominance, or say shocking things. This selective impulsivity suggested that the behavior served specific emotional functions for Cartman. Fish Sticks from season 13 demonstrated Cartman's inability to regulate his emotional reactions when his self-image was threatened. In the episode, Jimmy created a joke about fish sticks that became extremely popular. Cartman convinced himself that he had been present when the joke was created and had contributed to it significantly. As the episode progressed, Cartman's false memories became more elaborate until he believed he was the primary creator of the joke. When Jimmy tried to correct Cartman's false memories, Cartman reacted with extreme anger and defensiveness. He could not tolerate information that contradicted his preferred version of events. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's emotional need to see himself as important and creative was so strong that it actually distorted his memory and perception of reality. When reality threatened his self-image, he experienced such intense emotional discomfort that his mind literally reconstructed events to protect his ego. The episode showed Cartman becoming increasingly agitated as Jimmy persisted in telling the truth. Cartman's voice became louder and more strained. His arguments became more desperate and irrational. He showed physical signs of emotional distress, including facial flushing and aggressive body language. These reactions were completely disproportionate to the actual situation, which was simply a disagreement about who created a joke. Dances with Smurfs from season 13 showed Cartman's emotional reactions when he was given power as the school morning announcer. Initially, Cartman used his position to make announcements about school events. However, he quickly began using his access to the public address system to pursue personal vendettas and make inflammatory statements designed to provoke reactions. A psychologist would observe that Cartman could not resist the impulse to abuse any power he was given, even when doing so would obviously result in that power being taken away. He understood intellectually that if he went too far, he would lose his announcer position. Yet he could not control the impulse to keep escalating his behavior. Each day, he would make more extreme announcements until the school had to remove him from the position. The episode demonstrated a pattern psychologists call self-defeating behavior. This means engaging in actions that work against your own stated goals. Cartman wanted to keep his announcer position because he enjoyed having a platform. Yet his impulsive need to say increasingly outrageous things guaranteed he would lose the position. He could not subordinate his immediate impulses to his longer-term interests, even when he clearly understood the consequences. Human Centipede from season 15 showed Cartman's emotional dysregulation in response to not getting something he wanted. When Cartman's mother refused to buy him an iPad, Cartman had an extended, extreme tantrum that went far beyond normal childhood disappointment. He screamed at his mother in public. He cried and rolled on the ground. He made scenes in stores. He sustained this tantrum for days, apparently unable or unwilling to regulate his emotional response. A psychologist observing this episode would note that Cartman was old enough to understand that tantrums would not actually make his mother buy him an iPad. He was not a toddler lacking the cognitive capacity to understand that tantrums do not work. He was a fourth grader who understood his behavior was manipulative and designed to wear down his mother's resistance through sheer persistence and public embarrassment. Yet there was also something genuinely out of control about Cartman's emotional state during these tantrums. He was not simply pretending to be upset. He actually became extremely emotionally distressed when he could not have what he wanted. His emotional reaction was real, even though he was also deliberately performing that reaction for manipulative effect. A psychologist might observe this as an interesting combination of genuine emotional dysregulation and strategic manipulation. Poor and Stupid from season 14 showed Cartman's impulsive decision-making when he decided he wanted to become a NASCAR driver. He learned that many NASCAR drivers were poor and not highly educated, so he immediately began trying to make himself poor and stupid. He started acting deliberately unintelligent and gave away all his possessions. A psychologist would note that Cartman made this decision impulsively, without any real planning or understanding of what NASCAR driving actually required. The episode demonstrated Cartman's pattern of becoming instantly obsessed with new goals and pursuing them impulsively without adequate research or preparation. He did not investigate what NASCAR drivers actually do, or how someone becomes a professional driver. He simply seized on one piece of information and immediately began pursuing it. This showed poor impulse control in goal setting and planning. Cartman Finds Love from season 16 showed Cartman's inability to control his reactions when things did not go according to his plans. Cartman decided that Token and a new African-American girl at school named Nicole should date because they were both black. When his attempts to force them together did not work the way he wanted, Cartman escalated his interference repeatedly. Each setback led to increasingly desperate and extreme attempts to manipulate the situation. A psychologist would observe that Cartman could not tolerate the uncertainty of letting situations develop naturally without his control. When people did not do what he wanted them to do, he could not simply accept that outcome and move on. He had to keep trying to control the situation, even when his interference was making things worse. This pattern suggested underlying anxiety about lack of control that Cartman managed through increasingly desperate attempts to force situations to match his expectations. Skank Hunt from season 20 showed Cartman's extreme emotional reaction when all the boys' electronics were taken away because someone was trolling people online. Cartman was not actually the troll, but he was punished along with all the other boys. His reaction to losing his electronic devices was intense and sustained emotional distress. He became depressed and anxious. He could not focus on other activities. He showed withdrawal symptoms similar to addiction. A psychologist would note that Cartman's reaction suggested he had become emotionally dependent on his electronic devices to regulate his emotional state. When these tools were removed, he lacked internal emotional regulation skills to manage his feelings without external technological assistance. This pattern of relying on external tools rather than developing internal emotional regulation is a significant concern in child development. Throughout all these episodes and many others, a consistent pattern emerged around Cartman's emotional regulation and impulse control. He could plan and delay gratification when working toward goals he cared about. However, when faced with frustration, threat, limitation, or situations that challenged his self-image, Cartman showed explosive reactions, sustained emotional distress, and inability to modulate his responses to appropriate levels. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as selective impairment in emotional regulation. Cartman's problems were not simply global deficits in self-control. Rather, specific types of situations triggered specific types of dysregulated responses. Threats to self-image triggered defensiveness and paranoia. Frustration of desires triggered rage and sustained tantrums. Social rejection triggered elaborate conspiracy thinking. Loss of control triggered desperate manipulation attempts. The combination of high intelligence with poor emotional regulation created particular problems for Cartman and everyone around him. His intelligence meant he could plan elaborate revenges when his emotions were triggered. His poor emotional regulation meant he was frequently triggered by relatively minor provocations. The result was a pattern where Cartman would experience disproportionate emotional reactions and then use all his cognitive abilities to act on those reactions in increasingly harmful ways. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's explosive emotional reactions stood in stark contrast to how he thought about himself. And nowhere was this contrast more visible than in how he responded to comments about his weight. Section 5. Self-image, insecurity, and obesity. One of the most psychologically revealing aspects of Eric Cartman's character is how he responds to his obesity, and how this defensive response reflects deeper patterns of insecurity and fragile self-esteem. A psychologist observing Cartman would note that his weight is an obvious physical characteristic that makes him stand out among his peers and becomes a frequent target for teasing and social rejection. What makes this psychologically significant is not the obesity itself, but rather how Cartman handles the social and emotional challenges that come with being overweight in an environment where other children notice and comment on physical differences. Throughout the entire series, other characters regularly point out that Cartman is fat. This happens in nearly every season and in hundreds of individual episodes. The comments range from simple observations about his size to direct insults and mockery. In a typical social environment, repeated comments about a physical characteristic would eventually lead most people to either accept the reality of that characteristic or to take steps to change it. Cartman does neither. Instead, he has developed an elaborate system of denial and defensive responses that protect his ego from confronting uncomfortable truths about his body. The most famous example of Cartman's defensive response is his repeated insistence that he is not fat, but rather big-boned. This phrase appears throughout the series in various forms. When someone calls Cartman fat, he responds with anger and denial, insisting that his size is due to his bone structure rather than excess body fat. A psychologist would recognize this as a classic defense mechanism called rationalization, where a person creates a more acceptable explanation for something that threatens their self-image. Weight Gain 4000 from Season 1 was the first episode to focus on Cartman's relationship with his weight and eating habits. In this episode, Cartman won an essay contest and was going to appear on television with Kathy Lee Gifford. He became obsessed with his appearance and wanted to gain weight to look more impressive on camera. The episode showed Cartman consuming enormous quantities of a weight gain supplement designed for bodybuilders, not understanding that the supplement was meant to be combined with exercise to build muscle. The episode demonstrated several things about how Cartman thought about his body. He did not see his existing weight as a problem. He associated larger size with importance and impressiveness rather than with health problems. He showed no understanding of nutrition or how bodies actually work. When other characters tried to tell Cartman that he was gaining too much weight too quickly, he refused to listen. Even when his weight gain reached obviously unhealthy levels, Cartman maintained his belief that he looked great. Fat Camp, from Season 4, directly addressed Cartman's obesity and his parents' attempts to help him lose weight. In this episode, Cartman's mother sent him to a weight loss camp for overweight children. The episode showed Cartman's resistance to acknowledging that he had a weight problem and his complete unwillingness to participate in activities designed to help him become healthier. Instead of exercising and following the camp's nutrition program, Cartman smuggled in junk food and spent his time eating candy and chips. A psychologist watching this episode would note several significant patterns. Cartman showed no internal motivation to lose weight or become healthier. He only went to camp because his mother made him go. Once at camp, he immediately began sabotaging the program. He replaced the other boy who was supposed to attend camp and had that boy stay at Cartman's house, pretending to be Cartman. The episode also showed that Cartman made money at the camp by smuggling in junk food and selling it to other campers. This demonstrated that Cartman saw the camp primarily as an opportunity for profit rather than as a chance to improve his health. Raising the Bar from Season 16 showed Cartman's mother trying another approach by buying him a mobility scooter. The episode satirized how some very obese people use motorized scooters to get around when walking becomes difficult. Cartman immediately loved the scooter because it meant he no longer had to walk anywhere. He began eating even more and gaining more weight because the scooter eliminated the need for any physical activity. A psychologist would note that the scooter removed natural consequences that might have eventually motivated Cartman to address his weight. When walking becomes difficult or uncomfortable, that physical feedback can sometimes prompt people to make changes. The scooter eliminated that feedback, allowing Cartman to continue gaining weight without experiencing immediate negative consequences. Throughout many episodes, other characters make comments about Cartman's weight, and his responses follow consistent patterns. When Kyle calls him fat, Cartman becomes angry and defensive, often responding with insults about Kyle being Jewish rather than addressing the comment about his weight. When Stan or Kinney mention his size, Cartman denies being overweight or changes the subject. When adults express concern about his health, Cartman dismisses their concerns as exaggerated. A psychologist would recognize these responses as ego defense mechanisms designed to protect Cartman's self-image from information that would require him to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about himself. By getting angry instead of reflective, by denying instead of accepting, by changing the subject instead of engaging, Cartman avoids confronting the reality of his obesity and what it might mean about his choices. The Poor Kid from season 15 had a scene where Cartman was placed in foster care temporarily, and the foster family served healthy meals with appropriate portions. Cartman was horrified by the small portions and the healthy food. He complained constantly about being hungry and demanded larger servings of less nutritious food. The episode showed that Cartman had become accustomed to eating large quantities of unhealthy food and experienced genuine distress when this pattern was disrupted. A psychologist might observe that Cartman appeared to have developed disordered eating patterns, where his sense of fullness and satisfaction were calibrated to much larger quantities of food than his body actually needed. The normal-sized portions that would satisfy most people left Cartman feeling deprived and hungry. This suggested that his relationship with food had become disconnected from actual physical hunger, and had instead become tied to emotional needs and habitual overconsumption. Episodes throughout the series showed Cartman eating constantly, often consuming junk food, fast food, and snacks rather than balanced meals. He frequently appeared eating chips, candy, or other snacks during scenes at school or at home. A psychologist would note that this constant eating behavior suggested Cartman might be using food to regulate his emotional state, or to provide comfort when he felt stressed or upset. The insecurity underlying Cartman's defensive response to his weight became visible in episodes where his weight was used against him in ways that hurt his feelings or damaged his social status. In Up the Down Steroid from season 8, Cartman pretended to be mentally disabled so he could compete in the Special Olympics and win easily. When other characters made fun of his weight during this episode, he showed genuine hurt feelings beneath his usual angry defensiveness. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's aggressive denial about his weight was actually evidence of how much the weight bothered him. If he truly did not care what others thought about his size, he would not react so strongly to comments about it. His extreme defensiveness revealed that the comments were hitting a vulnerable spot in his self-image. The more vigorously he denied being fat, the more obvious it became that being fat was something he felt ashamed of, despite his outward bravado. Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000 from season 4 showed other aspects of how Cartman's weight affected his social standing. During the trial and aftermath, various characters made comments about Cartman's weight as part of their general mockery of him. Cartman's responses showed that he understood his weight made him a target for ridicule, but that he had no effective strategy for dealing with this reality, other than denial and counterattack. The episode demonstrated a pattern where Cartman's weight became intertwined with other aspects of his social identity and status struggles. When he was in conflict with other children, they would use his weight as ammunition against him because they knew it bothered him. When he tried to assert dominance or superiority, others would point to his weight as evidence that he was not actually superior. Make Love, Not Warcraft from season 10 showed Cartman and his friends spending extended time playing World of Warcraft online. During the episode, all the boys gained weight from sitting and playing video games instead of being physically active. The episode showed Cartman eating junk food while playing, completely absorbed in the game and unaware of how his sedentary behavior was affecting his body. What made Cartman's relationship with his weight psychologically significant was how it revealed his broader patterns of dealing with uncomfortable realities. When confronted with information that threatened his self-image, Cartman's consistent response was denial and defensive anger rather than reflection and adaptation. This same pattern appeared in many other areas of his life. When told he had done something wrong, he denied responsibility. When told he had failed at something, he blamed external factors. When told he should change his behavior, he insisted everyone else was wrong. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as indicating very fragile self-esteem beneath Cartman's outward confidence and aggression. People with genuinely secure self-esteem can acknowledge their flaws and limitations without experiencing overwhelming emotional distress. They can hear criticism and evaluate whether it has merit without becoming defensive. Cartman showed the opposite pattern. Any criticism or negative feedback triggered immediate defensive responses designed to protect his ego from having to acknowledge imperfection. The relationship between Cartman's weight and his social insecurity became clearer in episodes where he tried to compete with other children for status or recognition. In situations where physical appearance or athletic ability mattered, Cartman's weight became an obvious disadvantage that he could not deny or explain away. This created situations where his usual strategies of manipulation and verbal aggression were ineffective. The Ring from season 13 had a subplot about Cartman's attempts to get a girlfriend. The episode showed that Cartman's weight was one factor that made girls less interested in dating him. While the episode dealt with this reality through comedy and exaggeration, It touched on a genuine psychological issue. Cartman wanted to be seen as attractive and desirable, but his weight worked against that goal. His response was not to address the weight, but to blame the girls for being shallow, or to pursue manipulation strategies. Episodes throughout the series showed Cartman photographing badly when his weight was visible in pictures or videos. He would react with anger when shown unflattering images of himself. He would try to prevent others from taking pictures of him from certain angles. These responses indicated that Cartman had some awareness of how he actually looked, even though he maintained his denial in verbal interactions. A psychologist would note this disconnect between Cartman's stated beliefs about his appearance and his behavioral responses to seeing images of himself. The defensive responses Cartman used regarding his weight appeared in many other areas where he felt insecure or vulnerable. When his intelligence was questioned, he responded with the same angry denial. When his popularity was challenged, he used the same defensive tactics. When his family background was mocked, he showed the same pattern of lashing out rather than acknowledging hurt feelings. A psychologist observing Cartman across hundreds of episodes would conclude that his defensive response to his obesity revealed important things about his overall psychological functioning. He showed limited capacity for genuine self-reflection and self-awareness. He relied heavily on defense mechanisms like denial, rationalization, and projection to protect his fragile self-esteem. He responded to vulnerability with aggression rather than with adaptation. These patterns suggested underlying insecurity that Cartman managed through elaborate psychological defenses rather than through actually addressing the sources of his insecurity. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The insecurity and defensiveness Cartman showed about his weight extended into how he related to other children, creating a consistent pattern of aggression and dominance in all his peer relationships. Section 6. Peer dynamics and aggression. A psychologist examining Eric Cartman's relationships with other children would observe a consistent pattern of using aggression, coercion, and manipulation to establish dominance rather than developing genuine, cooperative friendships based on mutual respect and affection. Cartman's peer relationships throughout the series showed him prioritizing control and status over connection and belonging. He viewed other children primarily as tools to be used, obstacles to be overcome, or threats to be neutralized, rather than as potential friends whose company he might genuinely enjoy. The most sustained and intense of Cartman's peer relationships was his complicated dynamic with Kyle Broflovsky. From the very first episodes of the series, Cartman singled out Kyle for particular hostility and antagonism. While Cartman was generally aggressive toward many people, his treatment of Kyle was persistent, personal, and often obsessive. A psychologist would note that this sustained focus on one particular peer suggested Kyle represented something specific and threatening to Cartman's psychological equilibrium. Throughout hundreds of episodes spanning 25 years, Cartman found ways to attack, humiliate, and hurt Kyle. These attacks often involved Kyle's Jewish identity, with Cartman making anti-Semitic comments and engaging in Nazi imagery specifically to cause Kyle distress. In The Passion of the Jew from Season 8, Cartman dressed as Hitler and organized a rally explicitly designed to upset Kyle. In Ginger Kids from Season 9, Cartman started a hate movement that Kyle eventually had to work to stop. These episodes showed Cartman using ideology and group dynamics as weapons against a specific individual he wanted to hurt. A psychologist would observe several things about this pattern. First, Cartman's attacks on Kyle were often disproportionate to anything Kyle had actually done to him. Kyle might criticize Cartman or oppose his schemes, but these ordinary friendship conflicts did not justify the level of sustained hostility Cartman directed at him. Second, the attacks seemed designed to target Kyle's core identity and values, suggesting Cartman understood what would hurt Kyle most deeply and deliberately aimed at those vulnerable points. Third, the persistence of the attacks over so many years indicated this was not just situational conflict, but rather something more fundamental about how Cartman related to Kyle. Some psychologists might interpret Cartman's obsession with Kyle as revealing deeper psychological needs. Cartman seemed to need Kyle as a rival and antagonist. Episodes where Kyle was absent or unavailable often showed Cartman seeking him out or becoming agitated by his absence. This suggested that Kyle served some psychological function for Cartman beyond just being someone to fight with. The rivalry gave structure to Cartman's social world and provided a consistent target for his aggressive impulses. Cartman's relationship with Stan Marsh was less intense, but still revealed important patterns about how Cartman interacted with peers. Stan sometimes went along with Cartman's schemes and sometimes opposed them, making him a more unpredictable social element than Kyle. Cartman responded to Stan's unpredictability by treating him instrumentally, being friendly when Stan was useful, and turning on him when Stan opposed his interests. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed no stable attachment to Stan independent of what Stan could do for him at any given moment. Episodes like You're Getting Old from season 15 showed the Stan and Cartman dynamic clearly. When Stan went through a personal crisis and became depressed, Cartman showed no genuine concern for his supposed friend's well-being. Instead, Cartman focused on how Stan's depression affected the group's activities and Cartman's own entertainment. This revealed that Cartman did not experience the emotional connection and concern for others' well-being that characterizes genuine friendship. Cartman's treatment of Kenny McCormick followed similar patterns. In early seasons, before Kenny's deaths became less frequent, Cartman showed no emotional reaction when Kenny died in various horrible ways. While this was played for comedy in the show's dark humor style, a psychologist would note that Cartman's complete lack of distress when a supposed friend died revealed his shallow emotional connections to others. In later seasons, when Kenny's deaths became rarer, Cartman continued to treat Kenny as a lower status member of the group, whose opinions and feelings mattered less than those of other boys. The clearest and most disturbing example of Cartman's peer dynamics appeared in his relationship with Butters Stotch. Butters was portrayed as innocent, trusting, and eager to please, making him particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Cartman exploited these qualities ruthlessly across dozens of episodes. In Casa Bonita from season 7, Cartman locked Butters in a bomb shelter and convinced him the world had ended specifically so Kyle would need a replacement guest at his birthday party and would have to invite Cartman. A psychologist analyzing the Cartman-Butters dynamic would observe a pattern of systematic exploitation. Cartman identified Butters as someone who could be easily manipulated, and then used him repeatedly for various schemes. In Butters' very own episode, and many others, Cartman involved Butters in activities that put Butters at risk while keeping himself safe. When things went wrong, Cartman would blame Butters or abandon him without hesitation. The death of Eric Cartman from season 9 showed this pattern clearly. After the other boys decided to ignore Cartman completely, Cartman recruited Butters to help him because Butters was the only child who would still interact with him. Cartman manipulated Butters into believing Cartman was a ghost and convinced Butters to help him complete various tasks. Throughout the episode, Cartman showed no appreciation for Butters' help and frequently became angry with Butters for not following instructions exactly as Cartman wanted. The relationship between Cartman and Butters revealed important things about how Cartman viewed social relationships more generally. A psychologist would observe that Cartman did not see relationships as reciprocal exchanges, where both people benefit and both people have responsibilities to each other. Instead, Cartman saw relationships as hierarchical arrangements, where he should receive benefits and other people should provide those benefits without expecting anything in return, except perhaps being allowed to remain in his presence. Cartman's treatment of other classmates showed similar patterns of dominance seeking and exploitation. In Christian Rock Hard from season 7, Cartman recruited Token and Butters for his band specifically because he thought he could control them. He assigned them roles without asking their input. He made all decisions about the band's direction without consultation. When Token questioned Cartman's approach or suggested alternatives, Cartman dismissed these suggestions and insisted on maintaining complete control. Episodes showing classroom scenes or schoolyard interactions consistently portrayed Cartman as someone who tried to dominate social situations through force of personality, manipulation, or threats. In The List, from season 11, when the girls made a ranking of boys from cutest to ugliest, Cartman immediately began scheming to manipulate the results. He could not simply accept a social judgment that placed him in an unfavorable position. He had to try to control the situation and reshape the outcome to favor himself. A psychologist would note that Cartman's constant need to dominate and control social situations revealed underlying insecurity about his social status and his relationships with peers. Children who feel secure in their friendships and comfortable with their social position can tolerate situations where they are not in control or where they are not the center of attention. Cartman showed intense discomfort anytime he was not dominating a situation, suggesting he felt fundamentally unsafe in social contexts where his control was limited. Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000 from season 4 showed how Cartman responded when his aggression toward peers resulted in serious consequences. After throwing a rock at Token and giving him a black eye, Cartman was arrested and sent to juvenile detention. The episode revealed that Cartman did not interpret this consequence as indicating he should treat his peers better. Instead, he focused entirely on the injustice of his punishment and on how to escape it. He showed no remorse about hurting Token, and no insight into how his behavior created the problem. The episode demonstrated a pattern where Cartman viewed any consequences for his aggressive behavior toward peers as unfair persecution, rather than as natural results of his actions. A psychologist would recognize this as an external locus of control combined with hostile attribution bias. Cartman did not see himself as responsible for the outcomes of his behavior. He saw external forces and other people as responsible for anything bad that happened to him. Cartman's use of bribery and coercion in peer relationships appeared throughout the series. In numerous episodes, when Cartman could not achieve his goals through manipulation or threats, he would offer other children money, food, or other rewards to get them to comply with his wishes. Fat Camp from Season 4 showed Cartman making money at weight loss camp by selling contraband junk food to other children. He understood that others had desires and needs, and he was willing to exploit those desires to gain compliance and make profit. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's use of bribery showed sophisticated understanding of motivation and incentives. He knew what other children wanted and used that knowledge strategically. However, this same sophisticated understanding was notably absent when it came to understanding reciprocal obligations and genuine relationship maintenance. Cartman understood transactional exchanges well, but seemed incapable of understanding or maintaining mutual relationships based on affection and loyalty. Episodes showing Cartman organizing other children for various schemes revealed his leadership style and how he conceptualized group dynamics. In the Coon trilogy from seasons 13 and 14, Cartman tried to organize other children into a superhero team with himself as the leader. He expected the other children to follow his directions without question. When they challenged his authority or suggested different approaches, Cartman became angry and tried to force compliance through intimidation and manipulation. The trilogy showed that Cartman could recruit followers when his goals aligned with what other children wanted. He could organize activities and coordinate group efforts when doing so served his purposes. However, he could not maintain leadership once the other children realized that Cartman's goals were purely selfish and that he did not care about the group's shared objectives. A psychologist would note this as evidence that Cartman's social skills were sufficient for short-term manipulation, but inadequate for building stable coalitions or genuine group loyalty. 1% from season 15 showed what happened when Cartman's peer relationships broke down completely. After being identified as the reason the whole school was punished, Cartman faced rejection from all his classmates simultaneously. His response was to retreat into paranoid conspiracy thinking, rather than to reflect on how his behavior and characteristics might have contributed to the situation. Even when facing total social isolation, Cartman could not acknowledge any personal responsibility or consider changing his approach to peer relationships. Throughout all these examples, a consistent pattern emerged in how Cartman approached peer relationships. He prioritized dominance over cooperation. He valued control over connection. He used aggression and manipulation rather than kindness and reciprocity. He viewed other children as tools or obstacles, rather than as fellow human beings deserving respect and consideration. These patterns would concern any psychologist observing them, because they represented fundamental difficulties with social relatedness that would likely cause ongoing problems throughout Cartman's development. A psychologist would also note that Cartman showed no improvement in his peer relationship patterns over time. The same problems visible in Season 1 persisted through Season 25, with no evidence of growth or learning. Most children improve their social skills as they mature, and as negative peer feedback helps them learn what behaviors are socially acceptable. Cartman showed no such improvement, suggesting either that he did not receive adequate feedback about his social failures, or that he received feedback but lacked the capacity or motivation to use it to change his behavior. The consequences of Cartman's peer relationship patterns were visible throughout the series. He had no genuine friends who cared about him for his own sake, rather than for what he could provide them. He was frequently rejected and excluded by other children. He spent enormous energy manipulating and controlling others, rather than simply enjoying shared activities. He missed out on the developmental benefits of genuine friendship, including learning cooperation, empathy, conflict resolution, and mutual support. These missed developmental opportunities likely contributed to maintaining the psychological patterns that made healthy peer relationships impossible for him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's aggressive dominance in peer relationships extended into how he handled disagreements and conflicts, where his consistent pattern was to escalate rather than resolve. Section 7. Conflict style. Escalation over resolution. A psychologist observing Eric Cartman's behavior across hundreds of episodes would notice a striking pattern in how he handles disagreements and conflicts with other people. When most children encounter conflict with peers or adults, they eventually learn strategies for resolving those conflicts through compromise, apology, or simply letting the matter go. Cartman shows a completely different approach. When he encounters any conflict or opposition, his consistent response is to escalate the situation rather than to seek resolution. This pattern of escalation appears so reliably across so many different contexts that it represents a fundamental aspect of how Cartman relates to others and manages interpersonal problems. The escalation pattern typically follows a predictable sequence that a psychologist would recognize as maladaptive. Someone does something that Cartman perceives as wrong or offensive. Instead of addressing the problem directly through conversation or accepting that not everything can go his way, Cartman begins planning elaborate revenge or developing complex schemes to reassert his dominance. As these schemes progress, Cartman invests more and more energy and resources into the conflict, often reaching levels that far exceed any reasonable response to the original offense. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as evidence of poor conflict resolution skills, combined with difficulty regulating emotional responses to perceived slights or challenges to his status. Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5 remains the most extreme example of Cartman's escalation pattern in the entire series. The conflict began with what seemed like a simple transaction, where an older boy named Scott Tenorman sold Cartman his pubic hair for $10 as a prank. When Cartman realized he had been tricked and made to look foolish, he felt humiliated in front of his friends. A typical response to this situation might involve accepting the loss, perhaps telling friends about what happened to warn them about Scott's pranks, or possibly attempting some minor prank in return to save face. Instead, Cartman became completely consumed with getting revenge on Scott Tenorman. The episode showed Cartman trying multiple revenge schemes throughout the story, all of which failed because Scott kept outsmarting him and turning Cartman's plans against him. When Cartman tried to get his money back, Scott tricked him into paying more money. When Cartman tried to embarrass Scott, Scott turned the situation around and embarrassed Cartman instead. Each failure only increased Cartman's determination and rage, rather than prompting him to reconsider whether the conflict was worth continuing, or whether he should simply accept the loss and move on. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed no ability to cut his losses and disengage from the conflict. Instead, each setback triggered more intense planning and more extreme schemes. The conflict escalated from a $10 loss to Cartman orchestrating the deaths of Scott's parents by training a pony to bite off a farmer's wife's prosthetic leg, which caused the farmer to shoot Scott's parents, and then tricking Scott into eating chili made from their bodies. The final revenge also involved inviting the band Radiohead, who Scott admired, to witness his breakdown and mock him for being a crybaby. A psychologist analyzing this episode would observe several deeply concerning patterns in Cartman's conflict behavior. First, the revenge was grossly disproportionate to the original offense. Being tricked out of $10 in a prank, while embarrassing, does not justify murder and psychological torture by any reasonable standard. Second, Cartman showed no signs of internal conflict or moral hesitation about the extreme measures he was taking. Most people would experience some moral discomfort or ethical concerns about harming others so severely, even people they strongly dislike. Cartman showed no such discomfort or hesitation throughout his planning. Third, the escalation continued over what appeared to be weeks or even months, showing sustained focus and careful planning rather than an impulsive outburst of anger that might be regretted later. Christian Rock Hard from Season 7 showed Cartman's escalation pattern operating in a different context involving competition. Kyle made a bet with Cartman about who could get a platinum record first with their respective bands. This was initially a friendly competition that could have remained light and fun, a way for the boys to challenge each other while pursuing their interests in music. Instead, Cartman became obsessed with winning the bet to the point where he formed a Christian rock band despite having no religious beliefs whatsoever. He manipulated his band members Token and Butters, used them for their musical talents without caring about their input or feelings, focused entirely on defeating Kyle rather than on enjoying music or genuine artistic expression, and systematically converted popular love songs into Christian rock songs by changing romantic references to religious ones. The episode demonstrated how Cartman turned ordinary competitive situations into all-consuming conflicts, where winning became the only thing that mattered. A psychologist would note that Cartman could not simply participate in competition for the enjoyment of the activity or the challenge of improving his skills. Every competition became a matter of establishing dominance and defeating his opponent in a way that proved his superiority. When obstacles appeared, such as learning that Christian music albums could not achieve the same platinum certification as secular music albums due to industry rules, Cartman's response was not to accept the limitations of the situation or to appreciate what he had accomplished. Instead, he became enraged and destroyed his own platinum record in frustration, showing that the goal was never actually about achieving platinum status or creating music. The goal was defeating Kyle, and when the rules prevented that specific victory, the achievement became completely meaningless to him. Casa Bonita from Season 7 showed escalation in response to social exclusion and rejection. Kyle was having a birthday party at Casa Bonita, a Mexican restaurant that Cartman loved and had wanted to visit for a long time. Kyle did not want to invite Cartman to his party, presumably because Cartman had been mean to him recently, or because Kyle simply did not enjoy Cartman's company. A reasonable response to not being invited to a party might involve feeling disappointed, possibly asking why you were not invited, and trying to repair the relationship, or simply accepting that not everyone gets invited to every event and that sometimes people do not want to include you in their activities. Cartman's response was to develop an elaborate and cruel scheme targeting the most vulnerable and trusting child he knew. He convinced Butters that the apocalypse had happened and locked Butters in a bomb shelter in his basement for what appeared to be several days. He created a fake post-apocalyptic environment in the shelter, edited news footage to make it seem like the world had ended, and kept Butters isolated and terrified so that Kyle would need a replacement guest for his party and would have to invite Cartman. The scheme involved elaborate deception that required significant planning, sustained manipulation of a vulnerable and trusting child, and tremendous effort to achieve the simple goal of attending a birthday party at a restaurant. A psychologist would observe that the effort Cartman invested in this scheme far exceeded any reasonable value of attending the party. He could have gone to Casa Bonita any time with his mother or his friends on a different occasion. The point was not simply going to the restaurant to enjoy the food, the arcade games, the cliff divers, and the other entertainment. The point was forcing Kyle to include him and demonstrating that he could overcome Kyle's attempt to exclude him. The conflict was fundamentally about dominance and control, rather than about the stated goal of attending a fun party. The death of Eric Cartman, from Season 9, showed what happened when Cartman could not escalate a conflict in his usual way. When all the other boys decided to ignore Cartman completely and act as if he did not exist, Cartman found himself unable to force them to engage with him. His usual strategies of manipulation, aggression, and escalation did not work when people simply refused to acknowledge his presence or respond to anything he said or did. A psychologist would note that Cartman's response to the situation revealed his deep need for engagement and attention, even when that engagement was negative or hostile. Unable to escalate the conflict through his normal methods of confrontation and manipulation, Cartman instead escalated internally, by constructing an elaborate explanation for why people were ignoring him. He decided he must be dead and must be a ghost that only certain people could see. He recruited Butters to help him complete unfinished business so he could move on to the afterlife. This internal escalation showed that Cartman needed the conflict and the drama that came with it. When external conflict was not possible because others refused to engage, he created internal, psychological drama to fill that need. A psychologist might interpret this as evidence that conflict and opposition were actually important to Cartman's sense of identity and his psychological equilibrium. He did not know how to exist in a world where people simply did not respond to him. Cartoon Wars from Season 10 showed Cartman escalating a conflict about a television cartoon show into a cross-country journey and attempts to shut down an entire television network. The conflict began when Cartman learned that the show Family Guy was going to air an episode showing an image of the Prophet Muhammad, which could potentially offend Muslims and possibly lead to terrorist attacks, according to Cartman's claims. Cartman claimed he wanted to prevent the episode from airing to protect people from potential violence and to prevent offense to religious sensibilities. However, his real motivation throughout the episode was that he hated Family Guy because he thought the show was stupid and unfunny, and he wanted the entire show canceled permanently. The episode showed Cartman traveling from Colorado to Los Angeles to try to convince network executives to pull the episode and cancel the show entirely. He made elaborate arguments about responsibility and safety. When they refused his demands and explained they had no intention of canceling a successful program, he attempted to destroy the machinery that the episode depicted as creating Family Guy episodes. A psychologist would observe that Cartman took a simple personal preference about television programming and escalated it into a campaign to destroy something that millions of other people around the world enjoyed watching. 1% from season 15 demonstrated Cartman's escalation pattern when he felt persecuted or victimized by others. After being identified as the student whose poor physical fitness score caused the entire school to be punished with restrictions and additional exercise requirements, Cartman faced anger and rejection from his classmates, who blamed him for ruining their freedom and causing them discomfort. Instead of acknowledging that his actual lack of fitness was responsible for the situation, or working to improve his fitness to help the school achieve better scores, Cartman escalated the situation by creating elaborate conspiracy theories about being framed by someone who wanted to destroy him. He set up investigation boards in his room with photographs of suspects and string connecting various pieces of supposed evidence. He interrogated other students about their whereabouts and possible motives for framing him. He became completely consumed with proving he was the victim of a vast conspiracy, rather than simply the least fit student in school. A psychologist would note that Cartman escalated the conflict internally, even though the external situation did not require or benefit from this escalation. A psychologist analyzing Cartman's conflict escalation patterns across all these episodes would identify several consistent features that appeared regardless of the specific situation or the people involved. First, escalation was Cartman's default and automatic response to almost any conflict or opposition. Second, the escalation was often grossly disproportionate to the original situation or offense. Third, once Cartman began escalating a conflict, he showed great difficulty stopping or moderating his response, even when the escalation clearly was not working or was making the situation worse. Fourth, the escalation often served Cartman's emotional needs for drama, control, and dominance, rather than serving any practical purpose or helping him achieve reasonable goals. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's pattern of escalating every conflict revealed his inability to let things go, a trait that connected directly to how he pursued specific goals with obsessive, unyielding focus. Section 8. Obsession and Fixed Goals. A psychologist observing Eric Cartman across hundreds of episodes would identify a striking pattern of obsessive goal pursuit, where Cartman fixates on specific objectives and pursues them with rigid, unyielding focus that overrides context, consequences, and the well-being of everyone around him. When Cartman decides he wants something or wants to achieve a particular goal, he becomes completely consumed by that pursuit, to the exclusion of other activities, relationships, and even his own broader interests. This obsessive quality to Cartman's goal pursuit represents a significant psychological pattern that differs from normal childhood determination or persistence. The distinction between healthy persistence and unhealthy obsession involves several factors that psychologists consider. Healthy persistence means continuing to work toward a goal despite obstacles, while remaining flexible about methods and willing to abandon goals that prove impossible or harmful. Unhealthy obsession involves rigid fixation on a single goal, regardless of changing circumstances, inability to consider alternative approaches or goals, and continuing pursuit even when the costs clearly outweigh any potential benefits. Cartman's goal pursuit consistently showed the characteristics of unhealthy obsession rather than healthy persistence. Scott Tenorman Must Die, from Season 5, demonstrated Cartman's obsessive pursuit of revenge in its most extreme form. After being tricked into buying Scott's pubic hair for $10, Cartman became completely fixated on getting revenge. The episode showed this obsession developing over time, with Cartman trying multiple revenge schemes and becoming more determined after each failure. A psychologist would note that Cartman's pursuit of revenge became totally disproportionate to the original offense. He spent weeks planning and executing increasingly elaborate schemes to hurt someone who had embarrassed him with a $10 prank. The obsessive quality of Cartman's revenge appeared in how he could not be distracted or dissuaded from his goal. Other activities, friendships, and interests became irrelevant. Only the revenge mattered. When the other boys tried to get Cartman to move on or suggested the revenge was getting out of hand, Cartman dismissed their concerns completely. A psychologist would observe that Cartman showed the kind of single-minded focus on his goal that excluded all other considerations, which is characteristic of obsessive rather than simply determined behavior. Christian Rockhard from Season 7 showed Cartman's obsessive pursuit of winning a bet with Kyle. The bet was about which of them could get a platinum record first with their bands. For most people, this would be a friendly competition that might motivate some effort but would remain fun. For Cartman, it became an all-consuming obsession. He formed a Christian rock band despite having no religious beliefs. He recruited band members through manipulation. He systematically converted popular love songs into Christian rock by changing romantic references to religious ones. The episode showed Cartman working obsessively on the band, practicing constantly and focusing entirely on achieving platinum status. A psychologist would note that the goal itself was arbitrary. Cartman did not care about music or Christianity. The only thing that mattered was defeating Kyle in this specific competition. When Cartman discovered that Christian albums could not achieve the same platinum certification as secular albums, he became enraged and destroyed his own platinum record. The obsession was not actually about achieving platinum status. It was about defeating Kyle, and when the rules prevented that, the achievement became meaningless. Casa Bonita from Season 7 demonstrated obsessive pursuit of the trivial goal of attending a birthday party at a restaurant. When Kyle did not invite Cartman to his birthday party at Casa Bonita, Cartman became obsessed with getting invited. He developed an elaborate scheme involving convincing Butters that the apocalypse had happened, and locking Butters in a bomb shelter for days. A psychologist would observe that the effort Cartman invested in this scheme was completely out of proportion to the goal. He could have gone to Casa Bonita any time. The obsession was not really about the restaurant, but about forcing Kyle to include him. The episode showed Cartman unable to enjoy Casa Bonita even after achieving his goal of attending, because he had committed crimes to get there and knew he would face consequences. A psychologist would note this as evidence that Cartman's obsessions were often self-defeating. His rigid focus on achieving specific goals prevented him from considering whether achieving those goals would actually make him happy, or whether the costs of achieving them outweighed the benefits. Make Love, Not Warcraft from Season 10 showed Cartman and his friends becoming obsessed with defeating a powerful player in World of Warcraft. The episode depicted the boys spending weeks playing the game constantly, giving up all other activities and focusing exclusively on leveling up their characters to become strong enough to defeat their enemy. While all the boys participated in this obsessive behavior, Cartman showed the most extreme dedication, playing almost continuously and becoming completely absorbed in the virtual goal. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's capacity for obsessive focus could be directed toward goals that required sustained effort and delayed gratification when he cared about the outcome. He could plan, practice, and persist over long periods. However, these same capacities were never directed toward pro-social goals like improving his relationships, developing real skills, or contributing to his community. The obsessive focus was only activated for goals that involved defeating others, achieving dominance, or satisfying his immediate desires. The Coon trilogy from Seasons 13 and 14 showed Cartman's obsession with being recognized as the best superhero in town. When Cartman created his superhero persona, the Coon, he became obsessed with getting media attention and being seen as the leader of the superhero team. When other children's superhero personas became more popular than the Coon, Cartman could not tolerate this threat to his status. He became obsessed with destroying his rivals and ensuring the Coon was recognized as supreme. The trilogy showed Cartman's obsession escalating to the point where he allied with the actual villain, Cthulhu, to gain power and eliminate the other superheroes. A psychologist would note that Cartman's obsession with achieving his goal of being the top superhero led him to completely abandon the supposed purpose of being a superhero, which was helping people and fighting evil. The goal became entirely about status and recognition, rather than about any underlying values or purposes. 1% from Season 15 demonstrated Cartman's obsessive response when he perceived persecution. After being identified as the student whose poor fitness caused the school to be punished, Cartman became obsessed with proving he had been framed. He set up elaborate investigation boards with photographs and string connecting pieces of supposed evidence. He spent all his time investigating, interviewing suspects, and developing increasingly complex conspiracy theories about who was responsible for framing him. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's obsession with proving he was framed prevented him from engaging with the reality of the situation or taking any steps to actually address the problem. If he had simply worked on improving his fitness, the issue would have been resolved. Instead, his obsessive focus on the conspiracy theory interfered with his sleep, his eating, his schoolwork, and his relationships. The obsession became more important than his actual well-being or functioning. Human Centipede, from season 15, showed Cartman's obsession with getting an iPad. When his mother refused to buy him one, Cartman became completely fixated on this goal. He threw sustained tantrums, made public scenes, and devoted all his energy to pressuring his mother to give in. A psychologist would note that the iPad itself was not particularly important. Cartman's obsession was with getting what he wanted, and not accepting no as an answer. The specific object was almost irrelevant. The pattern was the same, regardless of what Cartman wanted. Poor and Stupid, from season 14, showed how quickly Cartman could become obsessed with new goals, and how completely he would commit to pursuing them without adequate thought or planning. Upon deciding he wanted to become a NASCAR driver, and believing that NASCAR drivers were poor and stupid, Cartman immediately became obsessed with making himself poor and stupid. He gave away all his possessions and started acting deliberately unintelligent. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's obsessive pursuit of this goal showed no consideration of whether the goal was actually desirable or whether his methods made any sense. Cartman Finds Love, from season 16, demonstrated obsession with controlling other people's relationships. When Cartman decided that Token and Nicole should date because they were both black, he became obsessed with making this relationship happen. He developed elaborate schemes to force them together, manipulated situations, and refused to accept that his interference was unwelcome. A psychologist would note that this obsession revealed Cartman's need to control situations and people around him, even when he had no legitimate interest in the outcome. Fish Sticks, from season 13, showed Cartman's obsession with maintaining a false narrative about having created a popular joke. When Jimmy created a joke about fish sticks that became widely popular, Cartman convinced himself that he had been present during the joke's creation and had contributed significantly. As the episode progressed, Cartman's false memories became more elaborate and his insistence on his version of events became more obsessive. He could not tolerate any information that contradicted his preferred narrative. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's obsession in this episode revealed how his need to see himself in a particular way could override his perception of reality itself. His obsessive commitment to the false narrative was so strong that he appeared to actually believe his own lies. The obsession served to protect his ego and his self-image rather than serving any external goal. From season 10 showed Cartman's obsessive focus on maintaining control over his mother and preventing her from developing relationships with other people. When his mother began working with behavior expert Cesar Millan and developing romantic feelings for him, Cartman became obsessed with destroying this relationship. He systematically sabotaged the relationship by making Caesar think Lois was emotionally unstable. A psychologist would note that Cartman's obsession with keeping his mother single and focused entirely on him revealed his deep need to control the people closest to him. Les Petites Tourettes, from season 11, demonstrated Cartman's obsession with exploiting a situation for maximum offensive impact. After faking Tourette syndrome so he could say whatever he wanted without consequences, Cartman became obsessed with saying increasingly shocking and offensive things on television. Even when his fake diagnosis was at risk of being exposed, Cartman could not resist the compulsion to continue his obsessive pursuit of saying the most outrageous things possible. A psychologist analyzing Cartman's obsessive goal pursuit across all these episodes would identify several consistent patterns. First, when Cartman fixated on a goal, he pursued it with total commitment, regardless of costs or consequences. Second, the obsessive pursuit often interfered with his normal functioning, relationships, and well-being. Third, Cartman showed rigidity in his pursuit, unable to adapt his approach or abandon goals even when circumstances changed. Fourth, the obsessions often served emotional needs like maintaining control, protecting his ego, or achieving dominance, rather than serving practical purposes. A psychologist would also note that Cartman's capacity for obsessive focus revealed that he did not lack the ability to plan, persist, or work toward long-term goals. His problem was not inability to delay gratification or lack of determination. His problem was that these capabilities were directed exclusively towards selfish, harmful, or meaningless goals. He never showed the same obsessive dedication to improving himself, helping others, or achieving anything of genuine value. The psychological function of Cartman's obsessions seemed to be maintaining his sense of control and power in a world that often did not cooperate with his wishes. By fixating obsessively on specific goals and pursuing them rigidly, Cartman could feel like he was actively shaping outcomes rather than passively accepting circumstances. The obsessions also provided structure and meaning to his life, even when that structure was oriented entirely toward destructive or pointless ends. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's obsessive pursuit of fixed goals showed how he related to objectives he chose for himself, while his relationship with rules and authority figures revealed how he responded when others tried to impose limits on his behavior. Section 9. Relationship with authority. A psychologist observing Eric Cartman's interactions with authority figures across hundreds of episodes would identify a consistent pattern of opposition, manipulation, and contempt for rules and the adults who enforce them. When most children encounter authority figures like parents, teachers, or police officers, they eventually learn that compliance with reasonable rules makes life easier and that challenging authority usually creates more problems than it solves. Cartman shows a completely different pattern. His default response to any authority figure or rule that limits his behavior is to resist, undermine, manipulate, or openly defy that authority. This pattern appears so consistently across so many different situations that it represents a fundamental aspect of how Cartman relates to structure and hierarchy in his social world. Cartman's relationship with his mother Leanne provides the clearest and most consistent example of how he responds to parental authority. In a healthy parent-child relationship, the parent sets reasonable boundaries and enforces consequences when the child violates those boundaries. The child learns over time that certain behaviors lead to negative consequences and adjusts accordingly. Cartman's relationship with his mother shows almost the complete opposite pattern. Leanne sets very few boundaries, enforces almost no consequences, and generally gives in to whatever Cartman demands, regardless of how unreasonable or inappropriate those demands might be. From Season 10, focused specifically on Leanne's attempts to gain control over Cartman's behavior, with help from various parenting experts. The episode showed multiple professionals trying different approaches to discipline Cartman and establish proper boundaries. Each expert would initially make some progress in controlling Cartman's behavior, showing that he was capable of responding to firm, consistent discipline. However, Leanne would eventually undermine the expert's authority by feeling sorry for Cartman, or by being unable to maintain the strict boundaries that were required. The most successful expert in the episode was Cesar Millan, who normally worked with dogs. He treated Cartman's behavioral problems the same way he would treat a misbehaving dog, using firm boundaries and consistent consequences. Under Caesar's guidance, Cartman's behavior actually improved dramatically. He became respectful, obedient, and well-behaved. A psychologist would note that this demonstrated Cartman was capable of responding appropriately to authority when that authority was exercised consistently and firmly. However, the episode ended with Cartman deliberately sabotaging his mother's developing romantic relationship with Caesar. When Leanne began to have feelings for Cesar, and Cesar showed interest in continuing to work with the family, Cartman recognized this as a threat to his control over his mother. He manipulated the situation to make Caesar think Leanne was emotionally unstable, causing Caesar to end his involvement with the family. A psychologist would observe that Cartman preferred having a permissive mother he could control over having proper discipline and structure, even when that discipline was clearly beneficial for him. Cartman's interactions with school authority figures showed a similar pattern of resistance and manipulation. Mr. Garrison, the boys' teacher in many seasons, attempted to maintain classroom order and enforce school rules. Cartman regularly challenged Mr. Garrison's authority through disruption, talking back, and refusing to follow instructions. When Mr. Garrison would try to discipline Cartman, Cartman would often find ways to manipulate the situation to avoid consequences, or to turn the situation to his advantage. The death of Eric Cartman from Season 9 showed what happened when the entire school decided to ignore Cartman completely. This was not an official punishment from authority figures. It was the other students deciding collectively to treat Cartman as if he did not exist. However, the episode demonstrated that Cartman interpreted this social rejection as a kind of ultimate authority, imposing the ultimate punishment. His response was to construct an elaborate alternative explanation, rather than to reflect on what he might have done to deserve this treatment. Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000 from Season 4 showed Cartman's response to legal authority when he was arrested and sent to juvenile detention for throwing a rock at Token that gave him a black eye. The episode explored whether this should be prosecuted as a hate crime because Token was black. Cartman's response to being arrested and imprisoned was not to feel remorse for hurting Token, or to acknowledge that throwing a rock at someone was wrong. Instead, he focused entirely on the injustice of the punishment and on escaping from detention. The episode showed Cartman in the juvenile detention facility, plotting his escape with another inmate. He did not see his time in detention as a consequence he deserved for his actions. He saw it as an unfair persecution that he needed to escape from. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed no ability to connect his behavior with the consequences he experienced. He externalized all responsibility, viewing the legal system and the authorities running the detention center as the problem, rather than seeing his own violent behavior as the source of his predicament. Chicken Lover from Season 2 provided an early example of what happened when Cartman was given authority rather than being subject to it. When the town's police officer went away to learn to read, he deputized Cartman and gave him police authority temporarily. Cartman immediately began abusing this power, pulling people over for trivial violations, beating suspects with his nightstick, and generally terrorizing the town. The episode showed that Cartman did not respect authority itself. He respected power and wanted to possess it so he could use it against others. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's behavior as a temporary police officer revealed his understanding of authority as purely about dominance and control, rather than about maintaining order or serving the community. When Cartman had authority, he did not try to help people or make the town safer. He used his authority to hurt people and make them afraid of him. This suggested that Cartman saw all authority relationships as fundamentally about who has the power to hurt whom. The Coon trilogy from seasons 13 and 14 showed Cartman's relationship with superhero authority and with media authority. When Cartman created his superhero persona, the Coon, he expected other children to recognize him as the leader of any superhero team and to defer to his authority. When other children's superhero personas became more popular than the Coon, Cartman could not tolerate this challenge to his assumed authority. He tried to destroy the other superheroes and establish himself as the sole recognized hero in town. The trilogy showed Cartman going to extreme lengths to be recognized as an authority figure, including forming an alliance with the actual villain, Cthulhu. A psychologist would note that Cartman's obsession with being seen as the leader and the authority figure revealed his deep need for dominance in hierarchical relationships. He could not simply participate as an equal member of a team. He needed to be recognized as superior to others and as having the right to tell them what to do. 1% from season 15 showed Cartman's response to school authority when faced with accountability for his poor physical fitness. The school administration identified Cartman as the student whose low fitness score brought down the school's average and caused everyone to be punished. This was a fair and accurate identification. Cartman genuinely was the least fit student. However, Cartman could not accept this exercise of authority and accountability. He immediately began constructing conspiracy theories about being framed and persecuted. The episode demonstrated that Cartman viewed any attempt by authority figures to hold him accountable as fundamentally illegitimate. A psychologist would recognize this as an external locus of control, combined with oppositional defiance. Cartman did not believe that authorities had legitimate grounds to impose consequences on him for his behavior or his characteristics. He believed that any negative outcome he experienced must be the result of unfair persecution rather than natural consequences of his own choices. Human Centipad from season 15 showed Cartman's response to parental authority when his mother refused to buy him an iPad. Leanne's refusal was reasonable. The device was expensive, and Cartman did not need it. However, Cartman could not accept this exercise of parental authority to set limits on his demands. He escalated through increasingly extreme tantrums and public scenes designed to force his mother to give in. The episode showed Cartman's complete inability to accept no from an authority figure as a legitimate response. A psychologist would note that Cartman had learned through years of experience that if he escalated his demands and his emotional displays far enough, his mother would eventually give in. This pattern reinforced his belief that parental authority was something to be overcome through persistence and manipulation, rather than something to be respected and obeyed. The episode ended with Cartman not getting the iPad he wanted, showing that even his mother had some limits. However, the episode also showed that Cartman learned nothing from this experience about accepting authority or limits. Breast Cancer Show Ever, from season 12, showed Cartman's attempts to use authority figures to protect him from consequences when Wendy challenged him to a fight. After making insensitive jokes about breast cancer, Cartman knew Wendy was going to beat him up. Instead of apologizing for his offensive behavior or accepting the fight as a consequence of his actions, Cartman spent the entire day trying to get teachers and other authority figures to intervene and prevent the fight from happening. He appealed to rules against fighting on school grounds. He tried to get the fight postponed. He attempted to manipulate the situation in every way possible to avoid facing consequences. The episode demonstrated Cartman's instrumental relationship with authority. He did not respect rules or authority figures in general. However, he was willing to appeal to rules and authority when doing so served his purposes. A psychologist would recognize this as evidence that Cartman understood social rules and authority structures well enough to manipulate them strategically. His problem was not a lack of understanding about how authority worked. His problem was a complete lack of genuine respect for authority as a legitimate constraint on his behavior. Cartman Joins NAMBLA from Season 4 showed Cartman's ability to completely ignore parental and societal authority about appropriate boundaries. When Cartman decided he wanted older friends because he found the other children immature, he joined what he thought was an organization for men and boys to be friends. The organization was actually the North American Man-Boy Love Association, a group of pedophiles. Cartman's parents and society had clear rules about children not associating with adult strangers, especially not groups of adult men seeking contact with young boys. Cartman ignored all these rules because they conflicted with what he wanted. The episode showed that Cartman's opposition to authority extended even to rules designed to protect him from harm. A psychologist would note that most children eventually internalize certain rules as being for their own protection and safety. Cartman showed no evidence of having internalized any rules whatsoever. Every rule was simply an external constraint to be evaded or overcome if it prevented him from doing what he wanted. Le Petit Tourette from Season 11 showed Cartman manipulating medical and social authority when he faked having Tourette syndrome. After learning that people with Tourette syndrome could say whatever they wanted without social consequences because their outbursts were involuntary, Cartman immediately began faking the condition so he could say offensive things without being punished. The episode showed Cartman successfully deceiving medical professionals, teachers, and his mother about having this neurological condition. A psychologist would observe that Cartman understood authority systems well enough to identify their weaknesses and exploit them. He recognized that medical diagnoses created special categories that exempted people from normal social rules. He recognized that authority figures like teachers and doctors had to defer to medical expertise. He used this knowledge to create a situation where he could violate social norms while being protected by the authority of a medical diagnosis. This demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how authority systems worked, combined with complete willingness to manipulate those systems for personal advantage. Throughout all these episodes and many others, a psychologist would observe several consistent patterns in how Cartman related to authority. First, he showed no genuine respect for authority as a legitimate constraint on his behavior. Second, he was willing to manipulate, deceive, or openly defy authority figures when doing so served his purposes. Third, he viewed all attempts to hold him accountable for his behavior as unjust persecution rather than as natural consequences. Fourth, when given authority himself, he immediately abused it to dominate and hurt others. Fifth, he understood authority systems well enough to manipulate them strategically when useful. These patterns suggested what psychologists call oppositional defiant behavior, where a person shows a consistent pattern of angry and defiant behavior toward authority figures. However, Cartman's opposition to authority was not simply emotional or reactive. It was strategic and instrumental. He opposed authority when authority constrained him, appealed to authority when authority could protect him, and sought authority when authority could give him power over others. This sophisticated and flexible relationship with authority suggested that Cartman's problems with authority were not about a lack of understanding or inability to comply. They were about a fundamental rejection of the legitimacy of anyone else having power over him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's defiance of authority revealed his need for control and dominance, which created a surprising contrast with how vulnerable and fragile he became when that control was genuinely threatened. Section 10. Vulnerability and Fragile Ego. A psychologist, observing Eric Cartman across hundreds of episodes, would notice a striking contradiction at the heart of his personality. On the surface, Cartman projects confidence, aggression, and dominance. He acts like someone who believes he is superior to everyone around him and who expects the world to conform to his wishes. However, beneath this outward bravado, Cartman shows signs of profound emotional fragility and vulnerability. When his self-image is genuinely threatened, when he faces real rejection, or when situations spin beyond his control, Cartman often reacts with disproportionate emotional distress that reveals how insecure he actually is underneath all his aggressive posturing. This pattern of fragile ego became visible in situations where Cartman faced challenges he could not overcome through his usual methods of manipulation, aggression, or escalation. A psychologist would recognize this as evidence that Cartman's outward confidence was not based on genuine self-esteem. Instead, it was a defensive structure built to protect a deeply insecure core. When that defensive structure was penetrated or bypassed, Cartman showed the emotional vulnerability he normally kept hidden. 1% from season 15 provided one of the clearest examples of Cartman's fragility under pressure. When Cartman was identified as the student whose poor fitness caused the entire school to be punished, he faced rejection and anger from all his classmates simultaneously. The other students blamed him for their lost privileges and made him feel responsible for their collective punishment. Cartman's response to this situation revealed the depth of his emotional vulnerability. Instead of accepting responsibility, or simply enduring the social rejection, Cartman became consumed by paranoia and defensive conspiracy thinking. He could not sleep properly. He could not focus on normal activity. He spent all his time creating elaborate investigation boards with photographs and string, trying to prove he had been framed. A psychologist would note that this response was grossly disproportionate to the actual situation. Being unpopular at school is unpleasant, especially when all your classmates are angry with you simultaneously. However, Cartman's response suggested he was experiencing this as an existential threat, rather than as a temporary social difficulty. The episode showed Cartman experiencing what appeared to be genuine anxiety symptoms. He looked tired and stressed. His usual aggressive confidence was replaced by defensive desperation. He interrogated other students with an intensity that suggested he genuinely believed he was in danger. A psychologist might interpret this extreme reaction as evidence that Cartman's sense of self was so fragile that he could not tolerate even temporary damage to his social standing or temporary acknowledgement of his flaws without experiencing a kind of psychological crisis. The death of Eric Cartman from season 9 showed another aspect of Cartman's vulnerability. When all the other boys decided to ignore Cartman completely and act as if he did not exist, Cartman could not cope with this social rejection using his normal strategies. He could not manipulate people who refused to acknowledge his existence. He could not fight with people who would not engage with him. He could not escalate conflicts when no one was willing to participate in conflict. Cartman's response to the situation was to construct an elaborate alternative reality where he had died and become a ghost. A psychologist would observe that this response revealed Cartman's profound need for engagement and attention from others. The idea that people might simply not care about him, might not find him important or interesting enough to engage with, was so intolerable that Cartman's mind created an alternative explanation that preserved his sense of importance. In Cartman's revised narrative, people were not ignoring him because he was not worth their attention. They were ignoring him because they literally could not see or hear him due to his being dead. The episode showed Cartman recruiting Butters to help him complete unfinished business so he could move on to the afterlife. Throughout this storyline, Cartman showed genuine distress and confusion. He was not simply pretending to believe he was dead as a manipulation strategy. He appeared to actually believe it, because the alternative explanation, that people simply did not want to interact with him, was too painful for his ego to accept. Skank Hunt from season 20 showed Cartman's vulnerability when his access to technology was threatened. When the boys' electronic devices were taken away as punishment for trolling that Cartman was not actually responsible for, Cartman experienced what appeared to be genuine withdrawal and distress. He became anxious and depressed. He could not focus on other activities. He showed signs of being emotionally dependent on his devices for regulation of his emotional state. A psychologist would note that Cartman's extreme reaction to losing his devices revealed his lack of internal resources for emotional regulation. When his external sources of comfort and control were removed, he had difficulty managing his emotional state. This suggested a fragility in his psychological functioning that his aggressive exterior normally masked. The episode also showed Cartman experiencing what looked like genuine fear about the future when he believed his relationship with a girl named Heidi might be threatened by his supposed online trolling activities. Fish Sticks from season 13 showed Cartman's fragility around his self-image and his need to see himself as creative and important. When Jimmy created a popular joke and Cartman convinced himself he had contributed to creating it, Cartman showed increasingly desperate and emotional responses as Jimmy tried to correct his false memories. Cartman's voice became strained and his arguments became increasingly irrational. he showed signs of genuine distress at having his false narrative challenged. A psychologist would observe that Cartman was not simply lying strategically about having created the joke. He appeared to genuinely believe his false memories, because accepting that he had not contributed anything important to the joke's creation was too threatening to his self-image. His ego was so fragile that it distorted his perception of reality, rather than accepting information that challenged his sense of being special and creative. Breast Cancer Show Ever from season 12 showed Cartman's vulnerability when faced with physical consequences he could not avoid. Throughout the day leading up to his scheduled fight with Wendy, Cartman showed increasing anxiety and desperation. He tried every possible strategy to avoid the fight, appealing to authority figures, attempting to postpone it, and trying to manipulate the situation. As these strategies failed one by one and the fight became inevitable, Cartman's anxiety became more and more visible. The episode showed Cartman becoming genuinely afraid. His usual aggressive confidence disappeared. He tried to get out of the fight by any means possible. A psychologist would note that underneath Cartman's aggressive exterior was someone who was actually quite afraid of physical confrontation when he could not control the situation or manipulate his way out of consequences. When forced to face a situation where his usual strategies would not work, Cartman's fragility became obvious. Weight Gain 4000 from season 1 showed an early example of Cartman's vulnerability around his self-image and his desperate need for recognition and validation. When Cartman won an essay contest and was going to appear on television with Kathy Lee Gifford, he became obsessed with his appearance and with making himself look impressive. He consumed massive quantities of weight gain supplement, not understanding that it needed to be combined with exercise to build muscle rather than fat. The episode demonstrated Cartman's deep need for external validation and recognition. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's self-worth appeared to be entirely dependent on external sources. He needed other people to see him as impressive and important. When he had an opportunity to be on television and receive public recognition, he became completely consumed with preparing for that moment, because it represented a rare opportunity to receive the validation his fragile ego desperately craved. Make Love, Not Warcraft from season 10 showed Cartman's vulnerability to addiction and to becoming absorbed in activities that provided him with a sense of achievement and power. When the boys spent weeks playing World of Warcraft to level up their characters and defeat a powerful enemy player, Cartman showed the most extreme dedication to the game. He played almost continuously, giving up other activities and becoming completely absorbed in the virtual world where he could be powerful and successful. A psychologist might interpret Cartman's extreme engagement with the game as evidence of his need to escape from a real world where he often faced rejection and failure into a virtual world where he could experience success and power. The game provided Cartman with experiences of achievement and competence that he struggled to obtain in his actual social relationships. His vulnerability to becoming absorbed in this alternative reality revealed the fragility of his real-world sense of self. Poor and Stupid from season 14 showed Cartman's vulnerability to impulsive decisions driven by his insecurities. When Cartman decided he wanted to become a NASCAR driver and learned that many NASCAR drivers came from poor backgrounds and were not highly educated, he immediately tried to make himself poor and stupid. He gave away all his possessions and started acting deliberately unintelligent. A psychologist would note that this impulsive and poorly thought out response revealed Cartman's underlying anxiety about not being good enough or successful enough in his current state. The episode demonstrated that Cartman's aggressive confidence was actually masking deep insecurity about his worth and his future. When he identified a new path to success and recognition, he impulsively threw himself into it without adequate planning or understanding. This suggested that beneath his outward certainty, Cartman was actually quite uncertain about himself and quite vulnerable to influences that promised him a clearer identity or path to recognition. The Passion of the Jew from season 8 showed Cartman's vulnerability to powerful emotional experiences and his tendency to become absorbed in ideologies or belief systems that gave him a sense of purpose and power. When Cartman watched The Passion of the Christ and became convinced that he needed to organize a movement against Jewish people, he showed the kind of intense emotional engagement that suggested he was filling some psychological need. A psychologist might observe that Cartman was vulnerable to belief systems and causes that gave him a sense of importance and justified his existing prejudices and aggressive impulses. His fragile ego needed external structures to support it, and he was willing to latch onto any ideology or movement that made him feel powerful and right. This vulnerability to ideological thinking revealed his underlying need for certainty and for external validation of his worldview. Throughout all these episodes, a psychologist observing Cartman would identify a consistent pattern where his outward aggression and confidence masked profound insecurity and emotional vulnerability. When Cartman's defenses were penetrated, when he could not manipulate situations to protect his ego, or when he faced genuine threats to his self-image, he showed disproportionate emotional reactions that revealed the fragility underneath. This fragility helped explain many of Cartman's worst behaviors: his aggression toward others, his constant need to dominate and control, his elaborate schemes to achieve recognition, and his inability to accept criticism or responsibility, all served to protect a very fragile sense of self from being exposed to information that might damage it. A psychologist would recognize that people with genuinely secure self-esteem can tolerate setbacks, criticism, and temporary failures without experiencing psychological crisis. Cartman showed the opposite pattern. Even minor threats to his self-image could trigger elaborate defensive responses. The vulnerability also explained why Cartman never seemed to learn from his experiences or to grow as a person, despite facing repeated negative consequences for his behavior. Learning and growth require the ability to acknowledge mistakes and weaknesses. Cartman's ego was too fragile to acknowledge genuine flaws without experiencing overwhelming distress. So instead of learning, he constructed elaborate defenses, blamed others, created alternative explanations, and did whatever was necessary to protect his fragile self-image from having to confront uncomfortable truths. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The fragility beneath Cartman's aggressive exterior helped explain why he needed such elaborate methods of justifying his harmful actions to maintain his self-image as someone who was always right and always justified in whatever he did. Section 11. Moral Reasoning and Self-Justification. A psychologist observing Eric Cartman across hundreds of episodes would notice something particularly concerning about how he thinks about right and wrong. When most people do something harmful to others, they experience some degree of guilt, shame, or moral discomfort. They recognize that their actions caused harm, and they struggle with the conflict between their behavior and their moral standards. Cartman shows a completely different pattern. When he does something harmful, cruel, or destructive, he almost always constructs elaborate justifications for why his actions were actually right, fair, or necessary. This pattern of self-justification appears so consistently across so many different contexts that it represents a fundamental aspect of how Cartman's mind processes moral questions. A psychologist would recognize this as evidence that Cartman lacks the normal mechanisms of conscience that cause most people to feel guilty when they harm others. Instead, Cartman's mind automatically generates justifications that allow him to maintain his self-image as someone who is in the right, even when engaging in objectively harmful behavior. Scott Tenorman Must Die, from Season 5, provides the most extreme example of Cartman's self-justification mechanisms at work. In this episode, Cartman orchestrated the deaths of Scott Tenorman's parents and tricked Scott into eating chili made from their bodies. This represents one of the most horrific acts of revenge in television history. Cartman showed no guilt or remorse about what he had done. Instead, he felt satisfaction and triumph because he had successfully defeated someone who had challenged him. Cartman framed the entire elaborate revenge as justified payback for Scott's original offense of tricking him into buying pubic hair for $10. In Cartman's moral framework, Scott had wronged him first by making him look foolish and taking his money. Therefore, any revenge Cartman took against Scott was justified as a response to that original wrong. The fact that the revenge was wildly disproportionate to the offense did not register in Cartman's moral calculations. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's complete lack of moral discomfort about orchestrating murder and psychological torture suggested either a profound deficit in normal empathy and conscience, or an extremely powerful system of self-justification. The Passion of the Jew, from Season 8, showed how Cartman could use external ideologies to justify his existing prejudices and harmful intentions. After watching The Passion of the Christ, Cartman became convinced that Jewish people were responsible for Jesus' death and that he needed to organize a movement against them. He dressed in a style that deliberately resembled Nazi imagery and gave speeches trying to rally people to his cause. In Cartman's mind, he was not promoting hatred or bigotry. He was responding to a legitimate historical grievance that the movie had revealed to him. He justified his anti-Semitic campaign as being about justice and accountability, rather than about prejudice. A psychologist would recognize this pattern, where Cartman took an external framework, in this case a controversial interpretation of religious history, and used it to justify actions that served his existing hostile feelings toward Kyle and Jewish people generally. Cartoon Wars from Season 10 showed Cartman justifying his attempt to get Family Guy canceled by framing it as concern for public safety and religious sensitivity. When Cartman learned that Family Guy would show an image of the Prophet Muhammad, potentially offending Muslims, he claimed he wanted to prevent the episode from airing to avoid terrorist attacks and to show respect for religious beliefs. However, the episode made clear that Cartman's real motivation was that he hated Family Guy and wanted the show canceled because he thought it was stupid. He used the controversy about depicting Muhammad as a convenient justification for pursuing his goal of destroying a show he disliked. A psychologist would observe that Cartman was sophisticated enough to recognize when his true motivations would not be socially acceptable, so he constructed alternative justifications that made his goals seem noble or protective rather than petty and selfish. Ginger Kids from Season 9 showed Cartman's pattern of justifying discrimination through pseudo-scientific reasoning. When Cartman gave a presentation claiming that red-haired, pale-skinned children with freckles were evil and should be eliminated, he used biological and genetic arguments to justify his hatred. He presented his prejudice as being based on objective facts about genetic differences rather than on arbitrary discrimination. When the other boys dyed Cartman's hair red and gave him pale makeup while he slept, making him wake up thinking he had become a ginger kid himself, Cartman immediately reversed his position. He began arguing that ginger kids were actually superior to other people and should rise up to take power. In both cases, whether arguing that ginger kids should be eliminated or that they should rule over others, Cartman constructed elaborate justifications that made his position seem logical and reasonable. A psychologist would observe that Cartman showed great flexibility in his justifications. He could argue passionately for one position and then argue equally passionately for the complete opposite position when his personal circumstances changed. This revealed that his justifications were not based on consistent principles or genuine beliefs. They were tools he used to make whatever he wanted to do at any given moment seem justified and right. Fish Sticks from Season 13 showed Cartman justifying his false claims about having created a popular joke through increasingly elaborate false memories. When Jimmy created a joke about fish sticks that became widely popular, Cartman convinced himself that he had been present when the joke was created and had contributed significantly to it. As the episode progressed and Jimmy tried to correct Cartman's false memories, Cartman became more and more insistent on his version of events. A psychologist would note that Cartman appeared to genuinely believe his false memories by the end of the episode. His need to see himself as creative and important was so strong that his mind actually constructed false memories to support that self-image. This suggested that Cartman's self-justification mechanisms operated at a very deep level, not just in his conscious thoughts, but in his actual perception and memory of events. 1% from Season 15 showed Cartman justifying his denial of responsibility for the school's poor fitness scores by constructing elaborate conspiracy theories. When Cartman was correctly identified as the student whose low fitness brought down the school average, he could not accept this information, even though it was objectively true and verifiable. Instead, he decided he must have been framed by someone who wanted to destroy him. Cartman's conspiracy theories became increasingly complex as the episode progressed. He created investigation boards with photographs and strings connecting supposed evidence. A psychologist would observe that Cartman's mind generated these elaborate alternative explanations to protect him from having to accept uncomfortable facts about himself. It was easier for his ego to believe in a vast conspiracy against him than to accept that he was simply the least fit student in school. Casa Bonita from Season 7 showed how Cartman justified extreme harm to an innocent person to achieve a trivial personal goal. When Cartman locked Butters in a bomb shelter for days after convincing him the apocalypse had happened, he justified this cruelty as necessary to achieve his goal of being invited to Kyle's birthday party at Casa Bonita. In Cartman's reasoning, he wanted to go to Casa Bonita very badly. Butters was in his way because Kyle would only need to replace Butters if Butters could not attend, and therefore tricking and imprisoning Butters was a justified means to an important end. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed no consideration for Butters' well-being, fear, or suffering in his moral calculations. The harm done to Butters simply did not factor into his moral reasoning. Human Centipede from season 15 showed Cartman justifying his treatment of his mother through his belief that he deserved to have whatever he wanted. When Leanne refused to buy Cartman an iPad, Cartman escalated to increasingly extreme tantrums and public humiliation of his mother. In Cartman's mind, his mother's primary purpose was to give him what he wanted. Her refusal to buy him the iPad represented a failure to fulfill her proper role. The episode showed Cartman having no awareness that his treatment of his mother was cruel or inappropriate. A psychologist would observe that Cartman had constructed a moral framework where his desires were the primary consideration, and other people existed to serve those desires. The Poor Kid from season 15 showed Cartman's justification for deliberately getting his mother arrested so he could go into foster care with a family that had better possessions than his own family had. When Cartman learned about a foster family that had nice things like a big TV and video games, he decided he wanted to live with them instead of with his mother. To achieve this, he manipulated situations to make it appear that his mother was abusing him. Cartman justified causing his mother to be arrested and separated from him by focusing on what he would gain from the foster family. He wanted their possessions and their lifestyle. His mother was preventing him from having those things by being his mother. Therefore, removing his mother from the situation was a justified way to get what he wanted. A psychologist would note that Cartman showed no love, loyalty, or gratitude toward his mother, despite her consistently trying to make him happy. From season 10 showed Cartman justifying his sabotage of his mother's romantic relationship with Caesar Milan by framing it as protecting his mother from making a mistake. When Leanne began developing feelings for Caesar, and Caesar was successfully disciplining Cartman, Cartman recognized this as a threat to his control over his mother. He manipulated the situation to make Caesar think Leanne was emotionally unstable. Cartman justified this sabotage by claiming he was protecting his mother. In reality, he was protecting his own ability to control his mother and avoid discipline. A psychologist would observe that Cartman framed his selfish actions as being for someone else's benefit, allowing him to maintain his self-image as a good son while actually acting to preserve his own power. Le Petit Tourette from season 11 showed Cartman's justification for faking a neurological disorder to say offensive things without consequences. When Cartman learned that people with Tourette syndrome had their verbal outbursts excused because they were involuntary, he immediately began faking the condition. In Cartman's reasoning, he wanted to say offensive things. The rules of society prevented him from doing so, and pretending to have Tourette syndrome was a clever way to get around those rules. Cartman showed no awareness that faking a real medical condition was wrong, or that using a real disorder as an excuse to be offensive was harmful to people who actually had Tourette syndrome. A psychologist would note that Cartman's moral reasoning focused entirely on finding loopholes and strategies to get what he wanted. Throughout all these episodes, a psychologist would observe several consistent patterns in how Cartman engaged in moral reasoning and self-justification. First, he almost never acknowledged that his actions were wrong without external pressure forcing that acknowledgement. Second, he constructed elaborate justifications that reframed harmful behavior as justified responses, necessary means to important ends, or righteous causes. Third, his justifications often involved claiming to be the victim or claiming to be protecting others when he was actually serving his own interests. Fourth, his moral reasoning focused on what he wanted to achieve rather than on principles of right and wrong. Fifth, he showed great flexibility in his justifications, able to argue for completely contradictory positions depending on what served his current goals. Sixth, his self-justification mechanisms sometimes operated through actual self-deception, where he appeared to genuinely believe his own justifications even when they contradicted obvious facts. A psychologist would recognize that Cartman's pattern of self-justification served important psychological functions. It allowed him to engage in harmful behavior without experiencing guilt. It protected his self-image as someone who was right and justified. It gave him narratives he could use to defend himself when his behavior was challenged. Most importantly, it prevented him from having to engage in genuine moral reflection or to change his behavior based on ethical considerations. The self-justification pattern also meant that Cartman never learned moral lessons from his experiences. When harmful behavior led to negative consequences, Cartman did not interpret those consequences as evidence that his behavior was wrong. Instead, he interpreted them as evidence that others were being unfair to him, or that the world was not working the way it should work. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. After examining all these specific behavioral patterns in detail, we can now step back and consider what Cartman's character reveals about personality, psychology, and how animated narratives allow us to explore complex psychological themes in Exaggerated Form, Section 12, What Cartman's Patterns Teach Us. After examining Eric Cartman's behavior across more than 2 decades and hundreds of episodes of South Park, we can identify clear patterns that a psychologist would recognize as significant. Cartman shows consistent difficulties with empathy, with emotional regulation, with accepting authority, with handling conflicts, with managing his self-image, and with moral reasoning. These patterns appear reliably across many different situations and contexts. They persist without meaningful change or growth over many years. They create significant problems for Cartman and for everyone around him. However, something important needs to be understood about analyzing a character like Cartman from a psychological perspective. Cartman is not a real person. He is a deliberately exaggerated cartoon character created to be funny, shocking, and entertaining. The writers of South Park designed Cartman to be an extreme representation of selfishness, cruelty, and childish narcissism. They push his behavior to absurd lengths that go far beyond what any real child would or could do. The show uses Cartman's extreme behavior for social satire, for dark comedy, and for exploring how far they can push boundaries while still being funny. When we look at Cartman through a psychological lens, we need to remember that we are examining a narrative construction rather than observing a real human being. Real people are more complex, more contradictory, and more capable of change than any fictional character. Real children, even children with serious behavioral problems, show more variability in their behavior than Cartman shows. They have moments of genuine kindness, periods of growth, and capacities for learning that Cartman consistently lacks, because the show's comedy depends on his remaining reliably terrible. That said, examining Cartman's behavioral patterns can still teach us valuable things about personality and psychology. Even though Cartman is exaggerated for comedic effect, the patterns he displays are recognizable as extreme versions of real psychological phenomena that psychologists study and work with. By looking at these patterns in their exaggerated cartoon form, we can understand them more clearly than we might when they appear in more subtle and complex forms in real life. Cartman's lack of empathy for others, demonstrated across hundreds of episodes, reflects real patterns that psychologists observe in people who have difficulty understanding or caring about other people's feelings. Most people develop the ability to feel empathy naturally as they grow up. They learn to recognize emotions in others and to care about those emotions. They feel uncomfortable when they cause others pain. These natural empathy responses help guide moral behavior and social relationships throughout life. Some people struggle with empathy for various reasons. They might have neurological differences that make reading emotions difficult. They might have experienced trauma or neglect that interfered with normal empathy development. They might have learned that showing empathy makes them vulnerable or gets them hurt. Whatever the cause, difficulties with empathy create significant problems in relationships and in moral development. Cartman's complete lack of empathy is an exaggerated version of this real phenomenon, pushed to absurd extremes for comedic effect. Cartman's difficulties with emotional regulation, shown in his extreme reactions to minor setbacks and his inability to manage frustration or disappointment, reflect real challenges that some children and adults face. Emotional regulation involves recognizing your emotions, understanding what triggered them, and managing your response in appropriate ways. Children gradually develop these skills as they mature, learning that throwing tantrums does not work and that calmer approaches to problems tend to be more effective. Some people struggle with emotional regulation throughout their lives. They react with extreme anger to minor frustrations. They cannot tolerate disappointment without experiencing overwhelming distress. They have difficulty calming themselves down once they become upset. These struggles can stem from various causes, including neurological differences, inadequate learning opportunities, or overwhelming stress that depletes regulatory capacity. Cartman's extreme emotional volatility is a cartoon exaggeration of these real struggles, made funny through absurd situations and consequences. Cartman's manipulation of others, demonstrated through elaborate schemes and strategic deception across many episodes, reflects real patterns that psychologists observe in people who have learned to use manipulation as their primary social strategy. Most people use some degree of social strategy and persuasion in their interactions. We learn to present ourselves in favorable ways, to emphasize certain aspects of situations, and to navigate social complexities through some degree of calculated behavior. However, some people develop patterns of chronic manipulation where they habitually deceive others, exploit trust, and use people instrumentally to achieve goals without caring about the impact on those being manipulated. These patterns often develop when people learn that honesty and direct communication do not work, but manipulation does work to get their needs met. Cartman's elaborate manipulation schemes are exaggerated versions of these real patterns, made entertaining through their complexity and their often comedic failures. Cartman's opposition to authority, shown in his consistent defiance of rules and his contempt for people in positions of power, reflects real patterns that psychologists recognize in oppositional and defiant behavior. Most children go through phases of testing boundaries and challenging authority as part of normal development. They gradually learn that some rules serve important purposes and that authority figures often have legitimate reasons for their decisions. Some children and adults develop more persistent patterns of opposing authority regardless of the reasonableness of the rules or the legitimacy of the authority. They automatically resist being told what to do, even when compliance would serve their own interests. They view all authority as illegitimate attempts to control them. These patterns can develop from various causes, including inconsistent discipline, modeling by adults who disrespect authority, or traumatic experiences with authority figures who abused their power. Cartman's absolute rejection of all authority is an extreme exaggeration of these real patterns. Cartman's fragile ego and vulnerability underneath his aggressive exterior, revealed in episodes where his defenses are penetrated, reflects real patterns that psychologists observe in defensive narcissism. Some people develop outward presentations of confidence, superiority, and dominance that mask deep insecurity and fragile self-esteem underneath. When their defensive exterior is challenged or bypassed, they experience intense emotional distress because their actual self-esteem cannot support them. These patterns often develop when people experience early failures in developing secure self-esteem based on genuine accomplishments and healthy relationships. Instead of building real confidence, they construct elaborate defensive structures that protect them from having to face their actual feelings of inadequacy. Cartman's combination of outward aggression and inner fragility is an exaggerated representation of this real psychological pattern. Cartman's pattern of self-justification, where he consistently rationalizes harmful behavior as justified and right, reflects real mechanisms that psychologists observe in moral disengagement. Most people experience moral discomfort when their behavior conflicts with their ethical standards. This discomfort motivates them to either change their behavior or to rationalize it in ways that reduce the psychological tension. Some people develop sophisticated patterns of rationalization that allow them to engage in harmful behavior while maintaining their self-image as good and moral. They reframe harmful acts as justified responses, necessary means to important ends, or righteous causes. They externalize blame and minimize harm. They construct alternative moral frameworks that make their behavior seem acceptable. Cartman's elaborate justifications for terrible behavior are extreme exaggerations of these real psychological mechanisms. What makes examining Cartman's patterns valuable, despite his being fictional, is that animation allows writers to isolate and exaggerate specific behavioral patterns in ways that make them easier to recognize and understand. In real life, people are complex mixtures of many different traits, motivations, and patterns. Problematic behaviors appear alongside positive qualities. People show inconsistency, change over time, and respond differently to different situations. This complexity can make it difficult to identify underlying patterns. Cartman, as a fictional character, displays remarkably consistent patterns that persist across hundreds of episodes spanning decades. The writers can isolate specific behavioral tendencies and show them operating in pure form without the complexity that real people inevitably display. This makes Cartman almost like a teaching case that demonstrates what certain psychological patterns look like when they appear in extreme and consistent form. The fact that Cartman never changes or grows also teaches us something about personality and behavior. In real life, people can change when they are motivated to change and when they have the support and resources to make changes happen. Therapy works, personal growth occurs, people can learn new patterns and develop better ways of relating to others. The fact that Cartman never changes across decades is both unrealistic and revealing. It shows us what personality would look like if it were completely fixed and resistant to all experience. Real children with behavioral problems similar to Cartman's patterns, though obviously far less extreme, can improve with proper intervention. They can learn empathy skills, They can develop better emotional regulation. They can find healthier ways to get their needs met than through manipulation and aggression. They can learn to respect authority and to engage in genuine moral reasoning. The fact that Cartman never learns or improves despite countless negative consequences is a narrative choice that serves the show's comedy. It is not a reflection of real human potential for growth and change. Examining Cartman also teaches us about how animated satire works to explore social and psychological themes. South Park uses Cartman's extreme behavior to comment on selfishness, prejudice, manipulation, and moral rationalization in society. By showing these traits in pure, exaggerated form through Cartman's character, the show makes viewers laugh while also making them think about these phenomena in real life. The comedy comes from recognition. We see aspects of real behavior pushed to absurd extremes, and we laugh at the absurdity while also recognizing the kernel of truth. The show also uses Cartman to explore how far someone can go while still justifying their behavior to themselves. Each episode pushes Cartman to new extremes, and each time he finds ways to rationalize what he has done. This speaks to real human capacities for self-deception and moral rationalization that, while not reaching Cartman's extremes, operate in smaller ways throughout ordinary life. What we learn from examining Cartman is not that real people display these exact patterns in these extreme forms. What we learn is that these patterns exist in real psychology, that they can be identified and understood, and that they create real problems when they appear even in much more moderate forms. We learn to recognize manipulation, lack of empathy, emotional dysregulation, opposition to legitimate authority, defensive narcissism, and moral rationalization when we see them. We also learn something about the value of exaggeration in understanding psychological phenomena. By seeing Cartman's patterns in pure and extreme form, we develop a clearer mental model of what these patterns look like. This can help us recognize them in subtler forms in real life. We become better at identifying manipulation because we have seen it in exaggerated form. We understand emotional dysregulation better because we have seen it pushed to absurd extremes. The cartoon character serves as a learning tool that improves our psychological literacy. Finally, examining Cartman reminds us that personality and behavior are not random. They follow patterns. These patterns make sense when you understand the psychological functions they serve. Cartman's lack of empathy allows him to use people without moral discomfort. His manipulation serves his goal of getting what he wants without having to develop genuine relationships. His opposition to authority protects his freedom to do whatever he wants. His fragile ego requires constant defense through aggression and rationalization. Each pattern serves a purpose in his psychological economy. Understanding that behavior follows patterns and serves functions does not mean excusing harmful behavior. Cartman's actions throughout the series cause real harm to other characters. His behavior is consistently terrible, regardless of how well we understand the patterns and purposes behind it. Understanding why people behave in problematic ways is different from accepting or excusing that behavior. Psychology helps us understand. Ethics helps us evaluate. Both are necessary for a complete picture. Cartman's character demonstrates that personality can be analyzed, that behavioral patterns can be identified, and that psychological phenomena can be understood even when they appear in exaggerated fictional form. The patterns we observe in Cartman teach us about manipulation, empathy deficits, emotional regulation problems, authority conflicts, defensive narcissism, and moral rationalization in ways that are clearer and more dramatic than we might encounter in ordinary life. These lessons have value even though Cartman is not real. They help us recognize these patterns when they appear in real people and real situations. They give us language and frameworks for thinking about personality and behavior. They remind us that psychology is not just about individual pathology. It is about understanding human patterns in all their variety, from healthy to problematic, from subtle to extreme. Eric Cartman will continue being exactly who he is across future seasons of South Park, because that is what the show needs him to be. Real people, thankfully, have more potential for growth, change, and learning than any cartoon character ever could. Examining Cartman's patterns helps us understand psychology. Living our actual lives requires us to grow beyond the patterns that limit us and to develop the empathy, regulation, humility, and moral awareness that Cartman will never achieve. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.